Picture the world before the rain. Not our world, not a world you would recognize, but a world that had been given every possible advantage and had spent centuries squandering it with extraordinary creativity. The sky above it had never opened. The ground beneath it had never been swallowed. The people walking across it had never watched a horizon fill with water from above, because that had simply never happened, not once, not ever. They had no frame of reference for annihilation. They had no inherited memory of a God who, when sufficiently grieved, would unmake what he had made. They were, in the most complete and literal sense, living in a world that had never yet been judged, and they conducted themselves accordingly. This is where the terror of the flood begins. Not in the rain itself, not in the rising water, not in the sound of timber cracking against a sky gone black and heaving. It begins in the silence before all of that, in the ordinary, irretrievable mundaneness of a world that did not know what was coming. It begins in the long, patient, devastating portrait that Scripture draws of a civilization so far gone that the only honest response left in heaven was grief. The word Genesis uses, when it describes God looking down at humanity in those years before the flood, is not fury, at least not first. It is something older and heavier than fury. The text says that the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And then, in one of the most arresting lines in the entire canon, it says that it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart. Repented, grieved at his heart. These are not the words of a God reaching for a weapon. These are the words of a Creator watching something beloved destroy itself, and finding no way forward except the one that costs everything, including the act of creation itself. To understand what the world looked like in those years, the years the ancient writers called the antediluvian age, the age before the flood, you have to sit with how long it had been running. Adam had been made in a garden, given a companion, given a world of extravagant provision, and had still managed to lose the garden inside a single generation. His son Cain had murdered his own brother over an offering. By the time the genealogies of Genesis 5 unspool across the page, a procession of men with lifespans measured in centuries rather than decades, the world had been filling up with people for a very long time, and the people had been filling up with something that would not be named charitably. The sons of God looked at the daughters of men and found them beautiful. This detail in Genesis 6 has consumed scholars and theologians and mystics for thousands of years. And the honest answer is that nobody knows exactly who the sons of God were, not with certainty, not in a way that admits no argument. What the text makes clear is what followed from it, a mingling that produced the Nephilim, giants in the earth, men of renown, figures so enormous in stature and reputation that the memory of them would haunt the imagination of Israel for centuries afterward. Numbers would later describe them as creatures beside whom ordinary men felt like grasshoppers. They were the products of a boundary crossed, of a category violated, of something that was not supposed to happen, happening, and producing offspring that were themselves the visible emblem of a world that had stopped paying attention to the lines between things. The Nephilim are one of the great unresolved mysteries of Scripture, and they deserve to be treated as such, rather than explained away into abstraction. Whether they were the children of fallen angels who had taken physical form, or the offspring of the powerful and corrupt among the human lineages, what they represent in the narrative is the same. A world in which the distinctions that God had built into creation, the separations and categories and boundaries that make order possible, had been eroded so thoroughly that even the boundary between the divine and the human, between heaven and earth, had become negotiable. A world like that has nowhere left to go but down. And down is precisely where it went. Into all of this, God looked. And what he saw was not a civilization in decline, not a people in need of a stern correction, not a nation that required a prophet and a generation of repentance. What he saw was a species that had reached a point where the very thoughts of its heart, every imagination, always and continuously, without exception, tended only toward evil. This is a clinical diagnosis more than a moral judgment. The machinery of human thought in that world had been so comprehensively corrupted that it no longer produced anything that pointed toward life. The engine was running, but it was running in only one direction, and that direction led nowhere a living thing could survive. God made a decision. He would blot out man, whom he had created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, and the creeping thing, and the fowls of the air. The scope of the sentence is almost impossible to hold in the mind whole. Every living thing, the entire surface of the planet cleared of everything that breathed. Not a punishment visited on one nation, not a plague that cut down the guilty and spared the innocent somewhere nearby, but a total withdrawal of the conditions that made life possible. A return to the formlessness that had preceded creation itself. The God who had spoken light into existence was now preparing to speak something into existence that would unmake most of what the light had illuminated. And then, Noah. He appears in the text with the quiet gravity of a man who has simply been what he was supposed to be in a time when nobody else was. The Scripture does not tell us that Noah was heroic or charismatic or a gifted leader who rallied people to his cause. It tells us something far more subversive than any of those things. It tells us that Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations, and that Noah walked with God. That last phrase is the one that matters. Walking with God is not a posture of triumph. It is a posture of proximity, of staying close, of not wandering off in the direction that everyone else had wandered. In a world where the imagination of every heart was only evil continually, walking with God was a revolutionary act, and Noah had been performing it quietly, without an audience, without apparent reward, for a very long time. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. He had a wife, though Genesis does not tell us her name, a silence that has felt like an omission to every generation of readers since. She would board a vessel of unimaginable purpose alongside her husband, survive the end of the world as she knew it, and emerge on the other side of history without a single line of dialogue attributed to her in the text. She was there. She survived. She watched everything she had known disappear beneath water, and she endured it, and she came out the other side, and the book gives her no name. The gap is part of the story. It always has been. God spoke to Noah. The conversation was direct, precise, and must have landed with the weight of every sentence that has ever been spoken to a human being who was not ready to hear it, and yet who, to their own surprise, did not run. The earth is filled with violence through them, God said, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make thee an ark of gopher wood. What followed were specifications of such detail and precision that they read like instructions from someone who had thought about this very carefully, which, of course, he had. The ark was to be 300 cubits in length, 50 cubits in breadth, 30 cubits in height. Translated into modern measurement, something in the vicinity of 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, 45 feet tall, a vessel of serious size. A vessel that could not be mistaken for a fishing boat or a river barge. A vessel that, once begun, could not plausibly be explained away as anything other than exactly what it was, preparation for something cataclysmic. Noah built it. This is the part the story tends to rush past, and it should not be rushed past, because it contains one of the most extraordinary sustained acts of faith in the entire biblical record. He built it in a world where it had never rained in the way it was about to rain. The ancient world understood a kind of moisture, a mist that rose from the earth and watered the ground, but the concept of 40 days and nights of continuous precipitation from a sky that had been holding its breath since creation, that was not in anyone's experience. Noah was building a solution to a problem that, from the outside, did not yet exist. Every morning he went back to the ark. Every morning the sky was still the same sky. Every day the neighbors, and they would have been his neighbors, the people he had lived among for decades, had available to them the evidence of his work as proof that something was wrong with him. And every day the sky stayed dry, which was proof that they were right and he was wrong. The rabbinical tradition, in its richest and most imaginative readings of this passage, has Noah taking a century to build the ark, with the understanding that the extended time was itself an act of divine mercy, a window during which the people around him might have looked at what he was building, asked why, heard the answer, and changed. They did not. The text gives no indication that a single person outside Noah's immediate family took the warning seriously. And Noah kept building. He did not know how long it would take. He did not know exactly when it would begin. He knew only that God had spoken, and that the speaking required a response, and the response required lumber and pitch and sweat and years of his life given over to a task that made no sense to anyone watching except the man performing it. God told him to bring 2 of every living thing, male and female, into the ark. 7 pairs of every clean animal, 1 pair of those that were not clean. Birds in their kinds, beasts in their kinds, everything that crept upon the ground. The logistics of this are enough to make the mind retreat into the comfort of allegory, but the text refuses allegory. It insists on the animals, in their pairs and their sevens, coming to Noah as if drawn by something older and deeper than instinct. They came to him. He did not hunt them down or coax them or build elaborate traps. The creation that was about to be unmade gathered itself into the ark under its own power, as if the created order understood something that the people standing nearby watching had not yet grasped. Noah was 600 years old when the flood of waters came upon the earth. The numbers of the antediluvian world are staggering by any reckoning. Lifespans of 800, 900, 969 years in the case of Methuselah, Noah's grandfather, whose death the rabbinical tradition places in the very year the flood began, as if the last of the old world's great patriarchs had to be gathered home before the waters could be released. 600 years is the specific age given for Noah, which means he had walked with God through 6 centuries of a world growing steadily worse, had built the ark across some portion of those years, and had done both of these things without the comfort of knowing how it ended. On the 17th day of the 2nd month of that 600th year of Noah's life, the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. Notice the order of that sentence, because the order matters. The fountains of the great deep first. The waters came from below before they came from above. The ancient understanding of the world's structure held that beneath the earth there were vast reservoirs of water, held in place by the surface of the ground, contained by a kind of cosmic architecture that God had constructed in the beginning when he separated the waters above from the waters below. Now that architecture was being unmade. The pressure seals of creation broke open, and water came up from inside the earth, from the bones of the world itself, before the sky ever opened. And then the sky opened too. The windows of heaven, the structures that held back the great canopy of water above the firmament, gave way, and what had been held in place since the 2nd day of creation came down. It rained for 40 days and 40 nights. 40 is not a casual number in Hebrew thinking. It is the number of testing, of completion, of a full and sufficient ordeal. The wilderness wandering would last 40 years. Moses on the mountain would last 40 days. Elijah's journey to Horeb would last 40 days. The rain that ended the old world lasted 40 days and nights. And in that time the waters rose above the hills, above the mountains, above the highest peaks of the ancient world, 15 cubits above them, which is to say approximately 22 feet of clearance above the tallest thing standing. Every hill was gone. Every valley was gone. Every city, every field, every road, every place where a person had ever stood and looked at the horizon, all of it was water. The surface of the earth had become the floor of a sea that stretched in every direction without a shore. Inside the ark, Noah and his wife and his sons and their wives moved through their days in the noise and the darkness. The sound of rain on wood for 40 days is not a sound that encourages philosophy or reflection. It is relentless. It does not stop when you have had enough of it. It does not pause to let you think. And under and around that sound was everything else. The animals, the movement of the vessel on a sea that had no bottom anyone could find, the absence of any horizon that offered information about where they were or how far they had come or how far there was yet to go. They had food, and they had each other, and they had God's word that this vessel would hold, and they had nothing else. Everything else was water. The people outside. This is the part that does not resolve cleanly, the part that sits in the chest like something undigested, because the people outside were not abstractions. They were the neighbors of Noah's long life, the merchants and the farmers and the craftsmen of a world that had been running for centuries. They had children. The children had no idea what their parents had imagined in their hearts, no idea what the accumulated weight of human corruption looked like from above, no idea that the strange old man with his enormous boat had been right all along. They simply watched the water come, and then they were in it, and then they were not anywhere. Scripture does not dwell on this. It does not catalog the dying. It simply reports it. All flesh died that moved upon the earth, both of fowl, and of cattle, and of beast, and of every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth, and every man. All in whose nostrils was the breath of life, of all that was in the dry land, died. Every living substance was destroyed, which was upon the face of the ground, both man and cattle, and the creeping things, and the fowl of the heaven, and they were destroyed from the earth. And Noah only remained alive, and they that were with him in the ark. The restraint of that language is itself a kind of terror. The text does not mourn what it reports. It simply reports it, and leaves the mourning to the reader, who has no choice but to feel the full mass of what those sentences contain. The waters prevailed upon the earth for 150 days. 150 days of a planet with no land, no ground, no surface that was not sea. The ark moved on the face of them, as once the Spirit of God had moved on the face of the deep, and the parallel is not accidental. The world was being returned to its pre-creation state, and the ark was the only fixed point of meaning left on its surface, which was itself a kind of sermon about what it means to be the one who walked with God, when walking with God was the most countercultural thing a person could do. And then God remembered Noah. The verb is devastating in its tenderness. God remembered. Not that God had forgotten, not in any simple sense, but that the moment of turning, the pivot from judgment back toward mercy, is expressed in the text with the intimacy of someone calling a name that has been on their mind the whole time. God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters began to recede. The fountains of the deep were stopped. The windows of heaven were closed. The rain was restrained. And the waters receded, slowly, steadily, over the course of weeks, the surface of the world beginning to reappear from beneath the sea that had covered it. The ark rested on the mountains of Ararat on the 17th day of the 7th month. Ararat is in what is now eastern Turkey, a range of peaks that includes the mountain still called by that name, a peak that rises to over 16,000 feet above sea level and carries snow on its crown year-round. That the ark came to rest on these particular mountains has sent thousands of people across 20 centuries scrambling up their slopes looking for evidence of timber, and none of them have returned with proof that satisfies everyone, which is precisely the kind of unresolved question that keeps the story alive. The mountain is there. The tradition is there. The wood, if it is there, has not yet consented to be found. Noah waited. This is the discipline that the story keeps returning to, not the building of the ark, not the survival of the flood, but the waiting. He waited after the rain stopped. He waited after the ark grounded. He waited until the tops of the mountains became visible in the 10th month. He sent out a raven, which flew back and forth until the waters had dried up. He sent out a dove, which returned with nothing. He waited 7 days and sent the dove again, and this time it came back with an olive leaf in its beak, fresh and green, the first piece of living vegetation that anyone inside that ark had seen since the world drowned. He waited 7 more days and sent the dove again, and the dove did not come back. The world had enough dry land to hold a bird. The world had resumed. God spoke again, "Come out of the ark." And Noah came out, and his wife, and his sons' wives, and every beast, every bird, everything that crept. All of it poured out of the ark, and back onto a planet that was wet and empty and beginning. Noah built an altar. He took of every clean beast and every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And the text says that the Lord smelled a sweet savor. A man who had survived the end of the world was giving the first thing he had back to the God who had saved him, and God received it with something that the text reaches for the language of pleasure to describe. God spoke into that moment, and what he said reframed everything that had just happened. He established a covenant not only with Noah, not only with his sons, but with every living creature on the earth, with the earth itself. He would never again curse the ground for man's sake. He would never again smite every living thing as he had done. While the earth remained, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night would not cease. And he set his bow in the cloud. The rainbow, as the sign of this covenant, an arc of refracted light in a sky still wet with the memory of what it had just done. A promise stretched between the clouds and the earth, visible from both sides. The rainbow is a covenant with all creation, which means it belongs to everyone who has ever looked up after rain and seen light break into color. But it was made in the context of the most complete act of divine judgment the world had ever witnessed, and it is only fully understood in that context. It is not merely beautiful. It is the beauty that follows something almost unbearable. It is what mercy looks like after justice has run to its absolute conclusion, and it hangs in the sky above a world still dripping with the evidence of what came before it. Noah planted a vineyard. He drank from its wine and became drunk, and what happened next in his tent opened a wound in his family that his sons would carry into the nations they founded. But that is a story for another telling. What matters here is the shape of the thing entire. A world so thoroughly corrupted that its creator chose to unmake it. One man who walked with God when walking with God was unremarkable to everyone watching. A boat built against all visible evidence that it would ever be needed. A flood that returned the earth to chaos, and a covenant written in light above the wreckage that promised the thing most needed after a judgment of that magnitude, that it would never happen this way again. The antediluvian world believed right up to the end that the rain would not come. It came. The lesson is not comfortable and was never meant to be. The rainbow is beautiful precisely because of what it follows, and what it follows was the most catastrophic act of divine judgment in the history of the created order, until the moment much later in the story of Scripture, when an even greater reckoning is promised, one that will not be by water, and one that makes everything that follows in this documentary feel, in its own way, like preparation for a finale still to come. But between the flood and the finale, the world had not been sitting quietly. Nations had spread across the earth from the sons of Noah. Cities had risen, trade routes had opened. And in the plain of the Jordan, in a valley so fertile and so green that Scripture compares it to the garden of the Lord itself, 5 cities had grown rich and powerful and, by the accounting of heaven, irredeemably wicked. Their names were Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Zoar. And the story of what happened to them has been burning in the human imagination ever since the day it happened, approximately 19 centuries before the birth of Christ, in a landscape that still bears, in the geological and mineral record of the Dead Sea region, What some have argued are the scars of something ancient and catastrophic. The story does not begin with fire. It begins with a man sitting in the shade. Abraham, the patriarch, whom God had called out of Ur of the Chaldeans and led across the ancient world to the land of Canaan, was 99 years old and sitting at the entrance of his tent at Mamre in the heat of the day, when he looked up and saw 3 men standing near him. The detail of the heat matters. Midday in that region in summer is not a time when travelers are expected. It is not a time when anyone with good sense is moving across the landscape. For 3 men to appear out of the shimmering afternoon heat, standing before a tent in the plains of Mamre, was itself already something outside the ordinary rhythms of the day, and Abraham seems to have recognized something in it immediately. He ran to meet them, which is a significant detail for a man of 99 years. He bowed to the ground. He called the apparent leader Lord, a word that in the Hebrew carries its weight carefully, capable of meaning a respected man, and also capable of meaning something more. He invited them to stay, to wash their feet, to rest beneath the tree, to eat before continuing their journey. He was insistent in the way that genuine hospitality is always insistent, pressing the invitation past its first polite refusal, and the 3 men agreed to stay. Abraham went quickly to Sarah and asked her to make bread. He ran to the herd and selected a calf, tender and good, and gave it to a servant who prepared it quickly. He brought curds and milk and the prepared calf and set it all before the 3 men, and he stood beside them under the tree while they ate. And while they ate, one of them asked a question that changed the entire shape of the afternoon. "Where is Sarah, your wife?" The question told Abraham something. These were not ordinary travelers. They knew his wife's name. They knew the name she had only recently been given, in fact, changed at the same moment that Abram had become Abraham, the new names that came with the covenant promise. The speaker followed the question with an announcement. At the appointed time when he returned, Sarah would have a son. Sarah, who was listening from inside the tent, and who was at that moment approximately 90 years old, heard the announcement and laughed. She laughed to herself, a private, involuntary, utterly human laugh of disbelief, the laugh of a woman who had stopped expecting things and had quietly made her peace with that. The response came immediately. Why did Sarah laugh? Is anything too hard for the Lord? Sarah, frightened, denied that she had laughed. The voice said, "No, but you did laugh." And then the 3 men rose and turned toward Sodom. What follows is one of the most extraordinary conversations in the entire biblical record, and it is extraordinary precisely because of what it reveals about the nature of Abraham's relationship with the God he had been following for decades. The Lord, for it is clear in the narrative now that the speaker among the 3 is the Lord himself, pauses before departing. He considers, in the text's own remarkable language, whether to hide from Abraham what he is about to do. The logic offered is this: Abraham is the one through whom all the nations of the earth will be blessed, so he is not a bystander to this business. He has a stake in it. He should know. The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah, the Lord tells Abraham, is great, and their sin is very grave. He is going down to see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come up to him, and if not, he will know. The 2 men, the angels, turned from that place and went toward Sodom. But Abraham stood still before the Lord. And then Abraham began to bargain. This is the intercession, and it deserves its full weight. Abraham, a man of considerable faith and considerable wealth and considerable standing, the one to whom God had promised land and descendants as numberless as the stars, stood before heaven and began to negotiate on behalf of 2 cities full of people he was not personally responsible for, people whose destruction had already been, in some sense, announced. He did not simply accept the news and send the travelers on their way. He stepped forward into the space between the announcement and the execution, and he began to talk. "Suppose there are 50 righteous within the city," he said. "Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to put the righteous to death with the wicked, so that the righteous fare as the wicked. Far be that from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just?" There is boldness in this question that is almost stunning in its directness. Abraham is not petitioning. He is making an argument. He is appealing to God's own character, to the justice that is inseparable from who God is, and using it as the basis of his plea. And God listened. "If I find 50 righteous in Sodom," the Lord said, "I will spare the whole place for their sake." Abraham pushed. "Suppose 5 of the 50 are lacking. Will you destroy the whole city for lack of 5? The Lord said he would not destroy it if he found 45. Abraham pushed again. 40, not destroyed. 30, not destroyed. 20, not destroyed. 10. If 10 righteous people exist in those cities, the Lord said, I will not destroy them. And Abraham stopped. He had gone as far as he went, down to 10, and the Lord departed, and Abraham returned to his place. Why did he stop at 10? This question has occupied interpreters for a very long time. Was it that he believed 10 was enough? That surely among all the people of Sodom there must be 10 whose lives merited the sparing of the rest? Was it that he had gone as far as the logic of his own argument allowed? Was it that somewhere in him he already knew the answer, already understood that 10 would not be found either, and that the stopping was not confidence but grief? The text does not say. Abraham stopped at 10, went home, and the story moved on without him for a while, down into the valley where the 2 angels walked toward a city that had no idea what was coming to meet it. Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom when they arrived. The gate of a city in the ancient world was not merely an entrance. It was the place of public life, of commerce and judgment and meeting, the place where a man of standing positioned himself to see and be seen. Lot, sitting at the gate of Sodom, tells you something about how far he had traveled from the man who had once shared a camp with Abraham in the open land of Canaan. He had chosen the plain of Jordan when Abraham had offered him first choice of the land, had chosen it because it was well-watered and rich and looked like the garden of the Lord, had pitched his tent towards Sodom first, and then, by degrees, had moved himself and his household inside it. Scripture describes Lot in the second letter of Peter, written much later, as a righteous man who was oppressed by the sensual conduct of the wicked, a man whose righteous soul was tormented day after day by what he saw and heard among them. The portrait in Genesis itself is more complicated, more human, and more honest. He was a man of genuine hospitality. As his invitation to the 2 strangers makes clear, he rose to meet them, bowed his face to the earth, pressed them urgently to come to his house, made them a feast, baked unleavened bread. He was also a man who had so thoroughly embedded himself in the life of a city he knew to be dangerous that his daughters were betrothed to men of Sodom, his sons-in-law, as they are called, men who had been born and raised in the culture Lot found tormenting. Before the men of the house lay down that night, every man of the city of Sodom, young and old, surrounded the house. The totality expressed in those words, every man, young and old, is important, and was clearly meant to be important. This was not a faction or a mob or a violent minority acting against the will of the community. This was the community. All of it. They called to Lot and demanded that he bring out his guests so that they could know them. And in the Hebrew of this text, in the context of this scene, no carries the full weight of its worst meaning. The crowd outside that house was not curious about the visitors' travel plans. Lot went outside and shut the door behind him. What he did next is one of those moments in Scripture that the careful reader has to sit with rather than rush past. because it is not comfortable and was not meant to be comfortable. He offered his 2 daughters to the crowd. He called them, in a sentence that is almost impossible to read without revulsion, women who have not known man. And he offered them instead of his guests, appealing to the crowd to do to them as they pleased, only to do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof. The laws of hospitality in the ancient Near East were not what modern sensibility would call proportionate. They were absolute. A guest who had passed beneath your roof was under your protection, at whatever cost that protection required, and the cost was not negotiable and was not excused by your personal comfort or safety. Lot's offer of his daughters was not, within the framework of his world, indifference to his children. It was the working out of a horrifying calculus in which the obligation to the guest outweighed everything else, including everything that should not have been wageable. The text records what he said without endorsing it, without excusing it, and without allowing it to work. The crowd rejected the offer. They told Lot that he had come as a sojourner and was now playing the judge. They pressed hard against him and moved to break down the door. The 2 men inside reached out their hands and pulled Lot back into the house and shut the door. And then they struck the men at the door of the house, both small and great, with blindness, so that they wore themselves out trying to find the door and could not find it. The image has a particular quality to it. Men stumbling in sudden darkness, groping for a door that their hands cannot locate, exhausting themselves against the wall of a house while inside it. 2 figures, who were not what they had appeared to be, waited with the full knowledge of what was coming with the morning. "Get your family out of this place," the angels told Lot. "The Lord is about to destroy this city, because the outcry against its people has become great before the Lord." Lot went to his sons-in-law, the men who were pledged to marry his daughters, and told them to get up, get out. The Lord is going to destroy this city. And the text records their response in 4 words that are among the most chilling in the entire Old Testament. He seemed to them as one who was mocking. They laughed at him. They had heard the voice of a man who had been sitting in Sodom long enough to know exactly what Sodom was, who had been tormented daily by what he witnessed. And they heard him say the city was about to be destroyed. And they laughed. They stayed. They are not mentioned again. With the dawn, the angels pressed Lot urgently. "Rise. Take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, lest you be swept away in the punishment of the city." And yet Lot lingered. He lingered in a burning house with his hand on the door. And the angels seized his hand and the hand of his wife and the hands of his 2 daughters, for the Lord being merciful to him. And they brought them out and set them outside the city. And then the instruction came with the absolute clarity of something that had no room in it for compromise. "Escape for your life. Do not look back. Do not stop anywhere in the valley. Escape to the hills, lest you be swept away." Lot, even now, negotiated. He could not make it to the hills in time, he said. The disaster would overtake him before he arrived. Could he flee to a small city nearby, the city of Zoar? The angel granted it. This city would be spared for his sake. "Hurry there, escape there, for I can do nothing until you arrive." The sun had risen on the earth when Lot came to Zoar. And then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven. The language distinguishes, as it often does at moments of profound import, between the Lord acting and the source from which he acts. From the Lord out of heaven, the fire came down, the sulfur, the brimstone, the burning compounds that the ancient world understood as the very material of divine wrath, fell from the sky onto the cities of the plain, and onto all the valley, and onto all the inhabitants of the cities, and onto what grew on the ground. He overthrew those cities. He overthrew the whole valley. He overthrew all the inhabitants of the cities, and what grew on the ground. The geography of the southern end of the Dead Sea has attracted significant attention from researchers across the 20th and 21st centuries. Scholars working in what archaeologists call the region of the Kikar The circular plain of the Jordan, where several ancient sites have been excavated along what would have been the northeastern shore of the sea. One site in particular, known in modern archaeological literature as Tal el-Hammam, situated in Jordan near the northeastern corner of the Dead Sea, has produced evidence of a sudden and catastrophic destruction event dated, in the current scholarly consensus, to somewhere around the mid-2nd millennium BC. Burned mud brick and pottery fragments, vitrified material consistent with extreme heat, a destruction layer followed by what appears to be a period of abandonment lasting several centuries. Whether this is Sodom is contested. Whether it is connected to the biblical account is contested. What is not contested is that something of extraordinary violence happened to whatever settlement occupied that plain at some point in the deep past, and that the people of the ancient world remembered it as a byword for the wrath of God. The debate about exact location and exact date is not the point. The point is what Scripture records in the morning that Lot walked into Zoar, that when Abraham rose early and went to the place where he had stood before the Lord and looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the valley, he saw the smoke of the land going up like the smoke of a furnace. He had bargained down to 10 righteous souls, and the cities would be spared. The smoke rising from the valley was the answer to that bargain. 10 had not been found. Not 10. Not in all of Sodom, not in all of Gomorrah, not in the whole of that fertile and prosperous and utterly corrupted plain. One family had been extracted from it, pulled out by the hands by angels who could not wait any longer for a man who kept lingering. And somewhere on the road between Sodom and Zoar, on the plain with the fire falling behind her and the angels' voices still in her ears and the specific, unambiguous instruction not to look back, still ringing through whatever she was thinking in those last moments, Lot's wife looked back. She became a pillar of salt. This is the detail that has fascinated, disturbed, and challenged every reader of this passage since it was written, and it should be allowed to be all of those things simultaneously. The instruction not to look back was not arbitrary. It was not a test of mechanical obedience. Looking back, in the context of that flight, was something deeper. It was the act of turning toward what was being destroyed rather than away from it, of placing your longing with the burning city rather than with the God pulling you out of it. Lot's wife had lived in Sodom. Her daughter's intended husbands were in Sodom. Her neighbors, her social world, the market where she bought her food, the street where her house stood, all of it was behind her, burning, and she turned to look at it. What she became, a pillar of salt, stands to this day in the imagination of the region. The Dead Sea area is rich in salt formations, great white columns of mineral deposit rising from the landscape, and local tradition in more than one period has pointed to one or another of these formations and said, "There she is." She is still there in the only sense that matters, which is that nobody who has read this account has ever forgotten her. Jesus would invoke her name centuries later as a warning to people who, when the time of judgment came, might be tempted to go back for their possessions rather than flee. Remember Lot's wife. 4 words. She needed no other epitaph. Lot came out of Zoar and settled in the hills with his 2 daughters because he was afraid to stay in Zoar. He and his daughters lived in a cave. And now the story enters a passage that the Sunday morning version of events tends to glide past with some speed, because what follows in the cave is uncomfortable in a way that demands engagement rather than avoidance. Lot's daughters believed they were among the last people alive. They had seen the plain destroyed. Their intended husbands were ash. They had no way of knowing who, if anyone, remained elsewhere in the world. The older daughter said to the younger, "Our father is old, and there is not a man on earth to come in to us after the manner of all the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve offspring from our father." They did this on 2 successive nights. and both daughters conceived by their father. The older bore a son named Moab, father of the Moabites. The younger bore a son named Ben-Ami, father of the Ammonites. Both nations would appear repeatedly in the subsequent history of Israel, sometimes as enemies, and sometimes as something more complicated. Ruth, the great-grandmother of King David himself, was a Moabitess, a woman of the lineage that began in that cave, which is the kind of detail that the story of Scripture keeps producing to remind the reader that God's use of broken material is not incidental to the story. It is the story. But go back a moment before the cave. Go back to Abraham standing on the height above the valley, watching the smoke rise. He had interceded. He had brought the number down to 10. He had asked the right question, "Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just?" And the judge of all the earth had done what was just, had found the cities without even 10 righteous souls among their populations, had rained fire and sulfur on them and overturned them, and left nothing standing. Abraham watched from a distance, as the valley where his nephew had chosen to live burned down to the stone. The distance between Abraham on his hill and Lot in his cave is not merely geographical. It is the distance between a man who had walked with God and kept walking, and a man who had chosen the well-watered plain, and found that well-watered plains have a way of becoming what Sodom became if the people living in them are not careful about what they are becoming themselves. Lot was not a wicked man. The tradition is careful to preserve his righteousness, his hospitality, his daily torment at what he witnessed. He was a righteous man who had made a series of small choices, each of them apparently reasonable, each of them tilting slightly toward the comfort of the valley, until he was sitting in the gate of a city that God had marked for destruction, with sons-in-law who laughed at warnings, and a wife who could not stop looking back. The fire that fell on Sodom and Gomorrah on that morning is the second great act of divine judgment in the record of Genesis, and it differs from the flood in a way that matters. The flood was universal. Every living thing, the whole surface of the world, returned to chaos. The fire on the plain was surgical, precise, targeted, visited on specific cities because of a specific and accumulated and entirely confirmed wickedness, while the countryside around it, Abraham's hills, Zoar, the land of Canaan, remained untouched. The move from universal judgment to particular judgment is a move in the narrative towards something more complex, a world in which God's reckoning with human evil becomes increasingly specific, increasingly tied to the choices and the histories of particular peoples and particular places. The 5 cities of the plain are used across the rest of the biblical canon as the definitive image of what complete and deserved destruction looks like. Isaiah invokes them, Jeremiah invokes them. Ezekiel provides, in a passage that surprises most readers, a list of Sodom's sins that is not limited to the particular violence of that night with the angels: pride, excess of food, prosperous ease, and failure to aid the poor and needy. A city is not destroyed because of one night's darkness. It is destroyed because of what produced that night, the long accumulation of choices that made a crowd of every man in the city, young and old, capable of what they attempted. The fire fell on the outcome, but the kindling had been laid over years, over generations, over the slow, comfortable, incremental process of a society deciding choice by choice what it would and would not permit itself to become. Sodom burns in Scripture the way certain events burn in memory, not as a historical curiosity, but as a recurring reference point, a thing that once happened that the biblical writers return to again and again when they needed an image of total, unambiguous, deserved destruction. It burns in the New Testament as well, invoked in Matthew, in Luke, in the letters of Peter and Jude, in the book of Revelation itself, where the great city at the end of days is described as spiritually called Sodom. The fire that fell one morning on the plain of Jordan has never fully gone out in the imagination of the Scripture or of the traditions that inherited it. Abraham walked back from the height. The smoke was still rising. His nephew was alive, barely, and would spend the rest of his life in a cave in the hills. His nephew's wife was a mineral deposit on the road between a burning city and a small town. His nephew's sons-in-law were bones in the rubble. The 10 righteous souls that might have saved everything had not existed. The bargaining had been good and had been honored and had been answered by silence, the silence of a valley with nothing left to say. The God who makes covenants also makes judgments. The God who hangs a rainbow in the sky and promises never to drown the world also rains fire on cities that have burned through every chance offered to them. Both things are true at the same time, and the story of Sodom is one of the places in Scripture where the reader is required to hold both without resolving the tension into something more comfortable. The rainbow was real. The fire was also real. The judge of all the earth does what is just, and justice is not always what the human heart, watching the smoke rise, finds easy to receive. Egypt was not watching any smoke rise. Egypt, in the period in which the events of Exodus unfold, was watching everything else rise. Its monuments, its granaries, its imperial ambitions, its reputation across the known world as the most sophisticated, the most durable, and the most divinely favored civilization on earth. The Nile Valley had been running as a coherent civilization for the better part of 2,000 years by the time Moses was born, and in those 2 millennia it had developed a theology, an architecture, a bureaucracy, and a self-understanding so comprehensive and so deeply interlocked that to attack one part of it was to attack all of it. Egypt did not merely have gods. Egypt was the gods, or at least it understood itself that way. The Pharaoh was not a king who prayed to deities at a safe distance. He was himself divine, the earthly embodiment of Horus, the son of Ra, the living incarnation of the cosmic order that held the world in its proper arrangement. And when the God of a nation of slaves decided to respond to 400 years of bondage, he did not send a petition. He sent 10 plagues, each one aimed with theological precision at a different pillar of the Egyptian worldview, dismantling the entire structure one deity at a time. The Israelites had been in Egypt for 430 years by the time the Exodus occurred. This number is not metaphorical. It is the accumulated weight of generations. Children born into slavery, who grew old in slavery, whose children were born into slavery. A cycle so complete and so long-running that the people inside it had no living memory of anything else. They had arrived in Egypt as honored guests in the time of Joseph, welcomed because Joseph had saved the empire from a 7-year famine, and because the Pharaoh of that era was a man grateful enough to honor the family of the man who had served him so brilliantly. But then, as the book of Exodus records with a quiet devastation that the brevity of its sentence makes worse, there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. That was all it took. 4 centuries of suffering began in that forgetting, in the simple, monstrous fact of a powerful man choosing not to know a name. The new Pharaoh looked at the Israelites and saw threat rather than history. They had become numerous, filling the land of Goshen with a vitality that a nervous administration reads as danger. He set taskmasters over them and put them to work, making mortar, making bricks, laboring in every kind of field work, building the store cities of Pithom and Ramesses. The harder he pressed them, the more they multiplied. So he escalated. He ordered the Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, to kill every boy born to an Israelite woman at the moment of delivery. The midwives feared God and did not do it, and when Pharaoh demanded an explanation, they told him the Hebrew women were so vigorous they gave birth before the midwives arrived. The boys kept living. Pharaoh made the order public and universal. Every son born to the Hebrews was to be thrown into the Nile, into this world. In the worst possible moment for a Hebrew boy to enter it, a woman of the tribe of Levi gave birth to a son. She looked at him and saw that he was a fine child, and she hid him for 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she made a basket of papyrus, coated it with bitumen and pitch, placed her son in it, and set it among the reeds at the river's edge. His sister stood at a distance to watch. The daughter of Pharaoh came to bathe at the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant to fetch it. She opened it, and the child was crying. She had compassion on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." The sister appeared and offered to find a Hebrew nurse. Pharaoh's daughter agreed. The sister ran and fetched the child's own mother, who was then paid by the household of the man responsible for enslaving her people to nurse her own son in safety. When the child was old enough, the daughter of Pharaoh took him into the palace and raised him as her own. She named him Moses, because I drew him out of the water. The man who would one day stand before Pharaoh and dismantle the theological credibility of the most powerful civilization on earth grew up inside that civilization's most privileged household. He was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. He would have known the court protocols and the priestly calendars and the names and attributes of every god in the Egyptian pantheon. He would have moved through the palace with the ease of someone born to it. And at some point, in some way the text does not fully explain, he also knew he did not belong there. The people working in the brick fields were his people, and the overseers standing over them with rods were doing so in the name of the house that had raised him. One day, Moses went out to see his people and their burdens. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. He looked this way and that, saw no one, struck the Egyptian down, and buried him in the sand. The next day, he saw 2 Hebrews quarreling. He asked the one in the wrong why he struck his companion. The man answered, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Moses was afraid. The thing was known. When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. Moses fled into the wilderness, all the way to Midian, and sat down at a well. The daughters of a priest of Midian came to draw water, and shepherds drove them away, and Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flock. Their father, called Reuel, and also Jethro, invited Moses to stay. He married the man's daughter Zipporah, who bore him a son he named Gershom, meaning, "I have been a sojourner in a foreign land." Moses, drawn from the Nile to be raised in a palace, was tending sheep in the Midianite desert, and the people in the brick fields were still making bricks. In those long years in Midian, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out, and their cry rose up to God. God heard their groaning. God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel. God knew. These 4 statements, each a separate act of divine attention, land in the text with the force of everything the 400 years before them had cost. God heard, God remembered, God saw, God knew. And then Moses was keeping the flock near Horeb, the mountain of God, and the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. The bush was burning. The bush was not consumed. Moses turned aside to look, which is one of the most understated responses to a supernatural phenomenon in all of Scripture. He was curious before he was afraid, a detail that tells you something important about the man. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him from the bush, "Moses, Moses." Moses said, "Here I am." "Take off your sandals," God said, "for the place where you are standing is holy ground." Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. "I have seen the affliction of my people," God told him. "I have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings. I have come down to deliver them, and I am sending you to Pharaoh." Moses spent the next several exchanges trying to negotiate his way out of the commission. "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh?" God said, "I will be with you. What if they ask your name?" "I am who I am," God said. Tell them, I am has sent you. Tell them, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is my name forever. What if they will not believe me? God gave him 3 signs: a staff that turned into a snake and back into a staff, a hand that became leprous and was healed, and the promise that Nile water poured onto dry ground would turn to blood. I am slow of speech, Moses said. Who made the human mouth? God said. Is it not I, the Lord? Please send someone else, Moses said. And God's anger burned against him, but he conceded the point. Aaron, Moses' brother, would speak. Aaron was already on his way to find Moses. The excuses were exhausted. Moses was 80 years old when he returned to Egypt. Aaron was 83. These are not young revolutionaries arriving at the palace with the momentum of youth and idealism driving them forward. They are old men, carrying between them a combined weight of experience and wilderness, years and prior disappointment. And they walked into the presence of the most powerful man in the ancient world and said, Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, Let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness. Pharaoh said, Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and moreover I will not let Israel go. He increased the Israelite workload that same day, requiring them to gather their own straw while maintaining the same production quotas for bricks. The people scattered across Egypt to gather stubble. Their foremen were beaten when the numbers came up short. They came to Moses and Aaron and blamed them for making everything worse. And Moses went back to the Lord and said, in the raw language of a man who had not been warned about this part, Lord, why have you done evil to this people? Why did you ever send me? Since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has done evil to this people, and you have not delivered your people at all. God told him, Now you shall see what I will do to Pharaoh. What God did to Pharaoh was methodical, escalating, and theologically deliberate. Each of the 10 plagues that followed was a targeted assault on a specific element of the Egyptian religious system, a public and unmistakable demonstration that the God of a nation of slaves was sovereign over every deity that Egypt had built its identity around, executed one by one with increasing severity across a period of months, while Pharaoh's heart moved in a terrible rhythm of hardening and partial relenting and hardening again. That is one of the most psychologically precise portraits of a man locked inside his own pride in all of ancient writing. The hardening of Pharaoh's heart is the theological problem at the center of the plague narrative, and it deserves honest engagement rather than a comfortable resolution. The text says both things simultaneously and without apology. Pharaoh hardened his heart, the deliberate choice of a man who made his decision and kept remaking it, and the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, the sovereign act of a God directing the drama toward its appointed conclusion. The biblical writers did not experience these two claims as contradictory. They understood that a man's inclination can become the instrument of a purpose larger than the man himself, that Pharaoh's pride was genuinely his own pride, running toward its natural end, and that this end was also precisely what was required to demonstrate before the entire watching world of the ancient Near East that the God of Israel answered to nothing in the Egyptian theological catalog. Pharaoh was not a helpless puppet prevented from doing what his better instincts demanded. He was a man who chose the thing he was inclined toward, again and again, until the choosing had run to its full and catastrophic conclusion. The first plague came when Aaron stretched out his hand over the waters of Egypt. Every body of water in the land turned to blood. The Nile, the canals, the ponds, the pools, even the water stored in wooden vessels and stone jars. The fish died. The river stank. The Egyptians could not drink from it. The Nile was not merely a river to Egypt. It was the artery of the entire civilization, the annual source of the floodwaters that made agriculture possible in an otherwise desert landscape, and it was the embodiment of the god Hapi, the deity of the inundation, the bringer of life. To turn the Nile to blood was to strike at the heart of Egyptian existence, and to announce, in terms no educated Egyptian could misread, that the God of Israel outranked the God of the river. Pharaoh's court magicians replicated the sign using their own techniques, which was the response of a professional class that could not afford to admit what it was watching. And Pharaoh went back to his house and did not take it to heart. The Egyptians dug along the banks of the Nile for water to drink. 7 days passed. Then the frogs came. Aaron stretched his hand over the waters, and frogs swarmed up from the Nile and covered the land, the houses, the bedrooms, the beds, the ovens, the kneading bowls. Frogs in every corner, in every room, inescapable and incessant. The frog-headed goddess Hecate was the deity of fertility and childbirth, her sacred animal, the frog, a symbol of abundance and new life. The plague transformed the sacred animal of a fertility goddess into an unbearable domestic catastrophe, made the sign of divine favor into a thing that climbed into your bed and your food. The magicians produced more frogs, which was a demonstration of their power that helped nobody and made the situation worse. Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and asked them to pray that the Lord would remove the frogs and he would let the people go. Moses asked, "When would Pharaoh like this to happen?" Pharaoh said, "Tomorrow." He asked for tomorrow. He was sleeping with frogs in his bed, and he asked for one more night of it, which suggests either extraordinary stubbornness or a man who needed time to arrange his thoughts before the next concession. Moses prayed. The frogs died in heaps, and the land stank with them. When Pharaoh saw the relief, he hardened his heart and would not listen. The third plague required no further warning and no negotiation. Aaron simply struck the dust of the earth with his staff, and gnats, or lice according to certain translations, came up out of the ground across all of Egypt, covering humans and animals alike. The earth itself, the soil of the agricultural land that fed the empire, was now producing affliction rather than crops. The magicians tried to replicate the sign and failed. They said to Pharaoh, with the gravity of men admitting something they had spent their careers preventing themselves from having to admit, "This is the finger of God." Pharaoh's heart was hard, and he would not listen. The fourth plague introduced a distinction that defined everything that followed. Dense swarms of flies filled the houses of the Egyptians and covered the ground across the land. The houses of Pharaoh's servants, the land of Egypt, all of it writhing with flies. But in the land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived, there were no flies, not one. God set a division between his people and Pharaoh's people. This boundary, drawn in the air by the sovereign will of the God who had created air, was its own declaration. This is not a natural disaster affecting everyone in its path indiscriminately. This is a judgment, and it knows exactly who it is for. Pharaoh called Moses and offered his first concession: sacrifice to your God within Egypt. Moses declined, explaining that what the Israelites would sacrifice was sacred to the Egyptians, and doing it in their presence would cause a riot. They needed to go 3 days into the wilderness. Pharaoh agreed, conditionally. Not too far, and Moses must pray for him. Moses prayed. Every fly departed, not one remained. Pharaoh hardened his heart again. The fifth plague killed the livestock of Egypt: horses, donkeys, camels, herds, flocks, all of them dead. Apis, the sacred bull, the living embodiment of the god Ptah, and one of the most venerated animals in the entire Egyptian religion, was dead with the rest of them. Hathor, the cow goddess of love and beauty and motherhood, could not protect the cattle she presided over. The entire theological infrastructure built around the sanctity of particular animals collapsed in a single morning. Pharaoh sent to inquire, and the report came back. Of the livestock of the Israelites, not one had died. Pharaoh's heart was heavy, and he did not let the people go. The sixth plague. Moses took handfuls of soot from a kiln and threw it into the air before Pharaoh. It became fine dust over all the land of Egypt, and caused festering boils to break out on humans and animals throughout the country. The magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils, which were upon them as upon every other Egyptian. Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess associated with disease, was also the goddess of healing, and her failure here was absolute and public. Thoth, the god of wisdom and medicine, offered nothing. The professional healers of Egypt were covered in open sores and could not stand upright. Pharaoh's heart remained hard. The seventh plague came with a warning delivered in advance, which is a detail worth holding. Even in the acceleration toward catastrophe, the text preserves the evidence of mercy embedded in the structure of the plagues. God gave Pharaoh's servants a choice. Bring your livestock and your servants inside before the hail comes, or leave them in the field, and they will die. Some of Pharaoh's servants feared the word of the Lord and brought their people and animals in. Those who did not paid the price. Moses stretched his staff toward heaven, and the Lord sent thunder and hail, and fire ran along the ground. It was the most severe hailstorm to fall on Egypt since it had become a nation. Everything in the open field died: people, animals, plants. The hail struck down every tree. Only in the land of Goshen was there no hail. Nut, the sky goddess, whose arched body was understood to be the sky itself, had been turned against the people she was meant to shelter. Pharaoh called Moses and said, "I have sinned this time. The Lord is in the right, and I and my people are in the wrong. Pray to the Lord. There has been enough of God's thunder and hail." "I will let you go." Moses went out and spread his hands toward the Lord. The thunder and hail and fire ceased. And when Pharaoh saw that the rain and hail and thunder had stopped, he sinned again and hardened his heart, he and his servants. Before the eighth plague, Pharaoh's own court officials came to him with something that amounted to a desperate plea. "How long shall this man be a snare to us? Let the men go. Do you not yet understand that Egypt is ruined?" The professional administrators of the most powerful empire in the known world were telling their king in the plainest possible terms that the game was over. Pharaoh called Moses back and offered a partial release. The men could go, but the children and the livestock? No. Moses said all of them would go. Pharaoh refused, and an east wind blew across the land all that day and all that night, and by morning the locusts had come. They covered the face of the whole land so that the land was darkened. They ate every plant in the land, and every fruit of every tree that the hail had left. Nothing green remained in all of Egypt, not a tree, not a plant in the field. The agricultural base of the empire was gone. Pharaoh called Moses and said, "I have sinned against the Lord your God and against you. Please forgive my sin this once, and plead with the Lord your God only to remove this death from me," Moses prayed. The Lord turned a very strong west wind that lifted the locusts and drove them into the Red Sea. Not a single locust remained anywhere in Egypt. Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he did not let the people go. The ninth plague required nothing from Moses but a raised hand. He raised his hand toward heaven, and there was thick darkness over all the land of Egypt for 3 days, darkness that could be felt. People could not see one another. No one rose from where they were for 3 days. Only the Israelites had light in their dwellings. Ra, the sun god, was the central figure of the entire Egyptian cosmic order. His daily journey across the sky in his solar bark, his nightly passage through the underworld, his triumphant reemergence each morning, these were not mythology to the Egyptians in the way that mythology functions for a modern reader. They were the operating system of reality, the account of how the world actually worked, the reason the sun actually rose. For 3 days, Ra did not rise. The most important deity in the Egyptian theological pantheon was absent, silent, and replaced by darkness that could be physically felt, while the people of a slave nation a short distance away in Goshen lived in ordinary light. Pharaoh called Moses one more time and offered his broadest concession yet. The people could go, including the children. Only the livestock must stay. Moses said the livestock must go too. Not a hoof shall be left behind. Pharaoh's anger broke through what remained of his diplomatic restraint. "Get away from me," he said. "Take care never to see my face again, for on the day you see my face, you shall die." Moses looked at him and said, "As you say, I will not see your face again." Before he left, Moses delivered the announcement that had been building beneath every plague, every confrontation, every morning of hardened heart and Egyptian suffering. He told Pharaoh what was coming next, and he told him in terms that left nothing open to misunderstanding. About midnight, Moses said, "The Lord will go out through the midst of Egypt. Every firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne to the firstborn of the slave girl who is behind the handmill, and all the firstborn of the livestock. There shall be a great cry throughout all the land of Egypt, such as there has never been, nor ever will be again. But not a dog shall growl against any of the people of Israel. Then you will know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel." Moses turned and walked out from Pharaoh's presence in hot anger. Pharaoh said nothing. What happened in Israel's households before the 10th plague is as important as the plague itself, because it was in the preparation for that night that God instituted something that would outlast Egypt, outlast Pharaoh, outlast the Exodus itself, something that would still be practiced 3,500 years later at tables around the world. He gave Moses instructions for a meal and for a ritual, the details of which were precise and purposeful and full of a meaning that would unfold across centuries. On the 10th day of the first month, each household was to select a lamb, a male, a year old, without blemish. They were to keep it until the 14th day of the month. At twilight on the 14th day, the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel was to slaughter their lambs. They were to take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and the lintel of the houses where they ate the lamb. That night they were to roast the lamb over fire and eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. They were to eat it in haste, dressed and ready, sandals on their feet, staff in hand, loins girded. This night was to be remembered. It was to be kept as a feast to the Lord throughout their generations, a statute forever. Unleavened bread was to be eaten for 7 days. This feast was called the Passover, and its name was earned on the night of the 10th plague. "For that night I will pass through the land of Egypt," God said, "and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both human and animal, and on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. When I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt." The blood on the doorpost was not magic. It was not a formula for protecting the deserving from the undeserving. It was the mark of a people who had heard the warning, had believed it, had acted on it, and who were standing inside their houses with their sandals on and their staffs in their hands, ready to move the moment the word came. The blood was obedience made visible. The blood was faith with a physical address. At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the livestock. Pharaoh rose in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where someone was not dead. Sit with that sentence for a moment. Not a house. In the most populous and prosperous nation in the ancient world, in the delta cities and the riverside towns and the villages along the canals and the great households of the court and the cramped quarters of the slums, in every single dwelling from the palace to the dungeon, in every room where a firstborn son or a firstborn animal had been sleeping, there was now a body. The cry that went up from Egypt in that hour was not the cry of a nation being punished abstractly. It was the cry of mothers and fathers and siblings standing over the bodies of people they had loved, in a darkness broken only by the desperate light of lamps being lit in every room of every house as people woke to the worst news they had ever received. The theological weight of the 10th plague is the heaviest of all 10, and it should be allowed to be heavy. The death of the firstborn of Egypt was the culmination of the judicial logic that had been running beneath the entire narrative since the opening of Exodus. Pharaoh had ordered every Hebrew son thrown into the Nile. He had attempted to kill an entire generation of Israelite firstborn males. The death of the Egyptian firstborn was not an arbitrary cruelty. It was a judgment that mirrored with exact and terrible precision the policy of the man who had decreed it. The measure he had used was the measure used on him, and the scale of the suffering visited on Egypt in that midnight hour was the scale of the suffering he had set in motion against Israel through 400 years of bondage and through his specific order of infanticide. Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron in the night. "Rise up," he said. "Go out from among my people, you and the Israelites. Go, serve the Lord as you have said. Take your flocks and your herds, as you have said, and be gone, and bless me also." The man who had said he did not know the Lord was asking the servants of the Lord for a blessing over his ruined house in the middle of the night, standing in a palace where his own firstborn son lay dead. The Egyptians were urgent upon the people, sending them out in haste, for they said, "We shall all be dead." The Israelites had been ready. They took their dough before it had leavened, bound their kneading bowls in their cloaks upon their shoulders, and they went. They asked the Egyptians, as they had been instructed, for silver and gold and clothing, and the Egyptians gave them whatever they asked, glad to be rid of them, for the dread of the Israelites had fallen on them. The people of Israel plundered Egypt as they left it, carrying out the wealth of the empire that had profited from their labor across 4 centuries, walking out of the land of their bondage in the middle of the night, with their bread unleavened and their sandals on their feet and their staffs in their hands, exactly as God had told them to be ready. About 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. A mixed multitude went with them as well, people of other origins who had seen what had happened and made their decision. The number of human beings walking out of Egypt that night, when you account for women and children and the mixed multitude, was somewhere in the range of 2 million people, which is an organizational and logistical reality so staggering that it has given skeptics reason to question and believers reason to stand in wonder, because an event of this scale, if it happened as described, would have been among the most extraordinary mass movements of people in the history of the ancient world. The length of time the Israelites had lived in Egypt was 430 years, to the day. At the end of 430 years, on that very day, all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. The precision of that phrase, "to the day," is a theological statement embedded in a historical one. The God who had made a promise to Abraham was a God who kept precise track of his own timelines. The 10 plagues taken together constitute an argument, structured and sequential and aimed at a specific audience. Each plague attacked a specific deity in the Egyptian theological system. The Nile was the domain of Hapi. The frogs were the sacred animals of Heket. The dust and earth were the domain of Geb. The flies and the gnats attacked the animals associated with various deities. The death of the livestock attacked Apis and Hathor directly. The boils represented the failure of Sekhmet and Thoth. The hail silenced Nut and Set. The locusts undid the work of Min, the god of the harvest. The darkness extinguished Ra. And the death of the firstborn was a judgment on Pharaoh himself, the god-king, the son of Ra, the man who had declared that he did not know the Lord. He knew by the end. He knew in the middle of the night, standing over the body of his son, asking the servants of a God he had spent months refusing to acknowledge for a blessing he could not earn and would not have been given time to wait for. The Passover became the defining event in the entire Jewish theological calendar, the moment the nation was born. The night God entered history, on behalf of a people who had nothing to offer him, except their presence inside a house with blood on the doorpost. Every subsequent act of God's deliverance in the Hebrew canon is described in relation to the Exodus. Every prophet who called Israel back to faith did so by invoking the memory of that night. Every generation of Jewish children has been told, "You were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord brought you out." You were there. The meal is not a memorial of something that happened to other people long ago. It is the reenactment of the night that made you who you are. The Passover lamb would eventually carry a meaning in the New Testament that the Israelites preparing their first meal did not have the frame of reference to anticipate. The Apostle Paul would write centuries later that Christ our Passover has been sacrificed. John, standing at the Jordan River, would point at a man walking toward him and say, "Behold, the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world." The unleavened bread broken at the Last Supper would be bread prepared, according to the instructions given in Exodus on the night before the death of Egypt's firstborn. The trajectory from the blood on the doorpost to the cross runs through the entire biblical canon, and it begins here, in the brick dust and the darkness and the sound of a nation crying out from every house, while 2 million people walked out through the gates of a broken empire toward a wilderness that would test them in ways that even Pharaoh had not managed. The empire that had defined the ancient world for 2,000 years woke on the morning after the Exodus to silence. Its workforce was gone. Its treasury had been partially carried out with them. Its firstborn were dead in every house. Its God-king had been stripped, in the space of 10 plagues, of every theological claim he had ever made about himself, standing exposed as the man who had said he did not know the Lord, and who had learned the Lord's name at the cost of everything he held. What came next for Israel in the wilderness would test the people who had just been delivered in ways they had not imagined, and what those tests produced, in rebellion and judgment and serpents and fire and the ground opening beneath the feet of the presumptuous, belongs to the story that follows this one. The wilderness is where the character of a people gets written, not in the palace, not in the moment of miraculous deliverance, not in the night of the Passover with the bread still unleavened and the sandals still on, but in the long, waterless, directionless stretch of days that follows the miracle, when the miracle has become memory, and the sun is still beating down, and the water is still absent, and the food is still not the food anyone would have chosen. The Sinai wilderness is not a gentle landscape. It is stone and heat and silence broken only by wind, a terrain that offers nothing to the traveler except the opportunity to discover what they are made of. For a nation of people who had spent 430 years making bricks for someone else, who had never had to manage their own provisions or navigate their own way or make their own collective decisions, the wilderness was a test of a severity and duration that the Passover night, for all its terror, had not been. The grumbling began quickly. It began, in fact, before the great events of Numbers, before Korah, before the serpents, before the ground opened. By the time the narrative reaches Numbers 16, it has already accumulated a substantial catalog of complaint. The people had mourned for the fish and the cucumbers and the melons and the leeks and the onions and the garlic of Egypt, which is a detail that only a genuinely observed account of human nature would bother to include, because it is so specific and so recognizably true to how people under pressure tend to grieve, not for the slavery, but for the particular flavors the slavery had permitted them. They had complained about the manna, the daily bread that came from the sky every morning except the Sabbath, bread that tasted of wafers made with honey, bread that had appeared from nowhere to feed 2 million people in a desert, and they had been tired of it. They had wanted meat. They had wept in their tents for the food of the country that had worked them to exhaustion and tried to kill their sons. They had built a golden calf, while Moses was still on the mountain, receiving the law that would govern their life as a people, had told themselves that this statue, which Aaron had made from their own earrings the previous afternoon, was the God that had brought them out of Egypt. They had sent 12 spies into the land of Canaan, and had listened to 10 of them report that the land was full of giants before whom the Israelites were as grasshoppers, and had believed the 10 over the 2 who came back with a single cluster of grapes so large. It took 2 men to carry it on a pole, and said, "The land is good, let us go in." Because of that collective failure of nerve, a generation had been sentenced to die in the wilderness, to wander for 40 years, until every man over 20 years of age who had refused to trust God at Kadesh Barnea was dead and buried in the sand, and their children had grown up to take their place. This is the accumulated context behind Numbers 16. Not a people in their best moment, not a nation at the height of its faith, but a people who had been living for some time in the consequences of their own repeated choices. A people whose defining failure had been to look at the evidence before them, the 10 plagues, the parted sea, the daily manna, the pillar of cloud and fire, and still find reasons not to trust the God who had produced all of it. They were not wicked in the straightforward way that the antediluvian world had been wicked, or Sodom had been wicked. They were something more common, and in some ways more instructive. They were people who had seen everything and kept finding excuses not to believe what they had seen. People whose fear of the future outweighed their memory of the past, even a past as spectacular as theirs. Into this context came Korah. Korah was a Levite, a descendant of Kohath, a man of standing within the tribe that had been set apart for the service of the tabernacle. He was not an outsider or a disgruntled foot soldier with no claim to anything. He had a position, a lineage, a role within the sacred structure of Israel's worship. He was not without honor. But honor, when it sits beside a larger honor it considers itself equally entitled to, has a way of becoming something darker than ambition, something more like grievance dressed in the language of principle. Korah gathered 250 men of the congregation, chiefs of the congregation, chosen from the assembly, well-known men. And he came with Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, and on the son of Peleth, sons of Reuben, and they assembled against Moses and Aaron. The charge they brought against Moses and Aaron was phrased in language that sounded, on its surface, almost admirable. They said, "You have gone too far. All the congregation are holy, every one of them, and the Lord is among them. Why then do you exalt yourselves above the assembly of the Lord?" The language of democratized holiness, the appeal to the equal standing of all the people before God, has a ring to it that a casual reading might mistake for theological sophistication. But the argument was not actually about the holiness of the congregation. It was about the positions held by 2 specific men, and the resentment of 250 other men who wanted what those positions represented. The claim that everyone was equally holy was not offered on behalf of the shepherds and the bricklayers and the women grinding grain. It was offered on behalf of chiefs and men of reputation who felt that Moses and Aaron had taken for themselves an authority that should have been more widely distributed, which is to say, distributed in their direction. Moses heard it and fell on his face. This response is worth noting because it is not the response of a man stung by criticism or threatened by a challenge to his authority. Moses fell on his face because he knew what the challenge actually was. It was not a challenge to him. It was a challenge to the God who had chosen him, and the God who had chosen him was not known for tolerating challenges of that particular kind in a mild or negotiable way. Moses had been up the mountain. He had seen the back of God. He had come down from 40 days of receiving the law with his face shining so brightly that the people could not look at him. He did not need defending by himself. But he also knew what was coming for the men standing in front of him, and the falling on his face was something more like grief than self-protection. He proposed a test. Let Korah and all his company take censers, fill them with fire and incense, and bring them before the Lord tomorrow. Aaron would also bring his censer. Whoever the Lord chose would be the Holy One. Let the God who had appointed Aaron to his office ratify that appointment in front of everyone, and let the same God deal with the alternative. Korah accepted. 250 censers would stand before the Lord the following morning, and the question of who was holy and who had gone too far would be settled by the only authority capable of settling it. Moses sent for Dathan and Abiram separately, because they had not been at the gathering or would not come, and their refusal to appear was its own statement. They sent back a message that was remarkable in its bitterness. Is it a small thing that you have brought us up out of a land flowing with milk and honey to kill us in the wilderness? That you must also make yourself a prince over us? They called Egypt a land flowing with milk and honey. They used the phrase that God had used to describe the promised land, to describe the country of their bondage, the country that had tried to murder their sons, the country whose grip 2 million people had walked out of in the middle of the night. This was not confusion about the facts. This was what resentment does to memory. It inverts it, makes the prison look like the garden and the garden look like the prison, until the mind genuinely cannot tell the difference between the thing that enslaved it and the thing that set it free. Moses was angry. His anger has the quality, in the text, of a man who has been patient for a very long time and has arrived at the end of what patience can accomplish. He told the Lord, "Do not respect their offering." He reminded the Lord that he had not taken so much as a single donkey from these people, had not done anything to harm them. Then he turned to Korah and said, "Tomorrow, bring your censers, you and all your company, and Aaron." The next morning, Korah assembled his company at the entrance of the tent of meeting with their censers, and the glory of the Lord appeared to all the congregation. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, "Separate yourselves from among this congregation, that I may consume them in a moment." Moses and Aaron fell on their faces again and said, "O God, the God of the spirits of all flesh, shall one man sin, and will you be angry with all the congregation?" Even in that moment, even facing the imminent destruction of 250 men who had organized to bring them down, Moses and Aaron were praying for the congregation, appealing for the innocent to be separated from the guilty before the judgment fell. This is a detail that says something specific about who Moses was, something that is easy to miss if you are reading the story as a power struggle rather than as the account of a man who genuinely did not want the authority he had been given, and who used it when he had to and grieved for those it cost. God answered the appeal. He would not consume the entire congregation. The community was instructed to move away from the tents of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. The people drew back. Dathan and Abiram came out and stood at the entrance of their tents with their wives and their sons and their little children. Moses spoke to all the congregation. "By this you shall know that the Lord has sent me to do all these works, and that it has not been of my own accord. If these men die as all men die, or if they are visited by the fate of all mankind, then the Lord has not sent me. But if the Lord creates something new, and the ground opens its mouth and swallows them up with all that belongs to them, and they go down alive into Sheol, then you shall know that these men have despised the Lord." And as soon as he had finished speaking all these words, the ground under them split apart. The earth opened its mouth and swallowed them up, with their households and all the people who belonged to Korah and all their goods. So they and all that belonged to them went down alive into Sheol, and the earth closed over them, and they perished from the midst of the assembly. All Israel who were around them fled at their cry, for they said, "Lest the earth swallow us up too." The ground opened and closed, and they were gone. Dathan and Abiram and their households, Korah and his household, not killed by a weapon or struck down by plague, but taken by the very ground beneath their feet, swallowed whole by the earth itself, still alive when they went in, gone into Sheol with the sound of the ground closing over them, ringing in the ears of everyone who had just taken several very large steps away from their tents. And fire came out from the Lord, and consumed the 250 men offering the incense. 2 separate judgments, 2 separate instruments, the ground for the leaders of the rebellion, fire for the 250 who had stood with censers in their hands. The censers of the 250, however, were not simply discarded. They had been brought before the Lord. They had been consecrated by that proximity, even if the men who had carried them were now dead. Eleazar the priest was instructed to gather them out of the blaze, for they were holy, and to hammer them into a covering for the altar, a broad plate of bronze laid over the surface of the place of sacrifice, as a perpetual visual reminder visible to every Israelite who came to worship for the remainder of the wilderness period and beyond. This happened, and here is why. And do not do this again. The memorial of judgment made permanent in the object of worship was a theological statement built into the architecture of the sacred space, inescapable and specific. The congregation gathered the next morning. This is the detail that produces a particular kind of despair in the reader who has been paying attention, because what the congregation gathered to do the morning after 250 of their leaders had been consumed by fire, and 3 households had been swallowed alive by the ground, was to complain. They came to Moses and Aaron and said, "You have killed the people of the Lord." 250 men of standing and 3 family groups had just been publicly and spectacularly destroyed for challenging the authority of Moses and Aaron, and the congregation's response was to challenge the authority of Moses and Aaron. The accusation was that Moses and Aaron had killed these people, which was precisely backwards, which meant that either the congregation had not understood what they had just witnessed, or they had understood it and decided to challenge it anyway, and neither possibility reflects well on the morning after. As they gathered against Moses and Aaron, they looked toward the tent of meeting. The cloud had covered it, and the glory of the Lord appeared. The Lord spoke to Moses, "Get away from this congregation, that I may consume them in a moment." Moses and Aaron fell on their faces again. Moses turned to Aaron with urgent instructions. "Take your censer, put fire from the altar in it, and lay incense on it, and carry it quickly to the congregation and make atonement for them. For wrath has gone out from the Lord. The plague has begun." Aaron ran into the midst of the assembly, and the plague had already started. He stood between the dead and the living, holding the censer of incense, and the plague was stopped. But 14,700 had already died, besides those who died in the affair of Korah. Aaron came back to Moses at the entrance of the tent of meeting. The plague was over. 14,700 people in one day's plague, on top of the deaths of the day before, because the congregation had accused Moses and Aaron of being murderers the morning after the earth had swallowed 250 of the people's most prominent citizens. Aaron, standing between the dead and the living with his censer, is one of the great images of priestly intercession in the entire Hebrew Scripture. The man whose authority had just been challenged, standing in the path of the judgment his challengers had provoked, not as a warrior but as a priest, with incense rather than weapons, making atonement for the people who had just accused him of killing their friends. God had one more piece of business to settle in the aftermath of Korah's rebellion. He instructed Moses to collect a staff from each of the 12 tribal leaders, with each man's name written on his staff, and Aaron's name on the staff of Levi. These 12 staffs were placed before the Lord in the tent of meeting, before the ark of the testimony overnight. The following morning Moses went in and saw that Aaron's staff had sprouted and put forth buds and produced blossoms and borne ripe almonds. Dead wood, cut from the tree, left overnight in a tent, had bloomed and fruited in the course of a single night. The other 11 staffs were unchanged. Moses brought all the staffs out to all the Israelites, and they looked, and each man took his staff. The Lord told Moses to put Aaron's staff back before the testimony, to be kept as a sign for the rebels, to put an end to their grumbling, so that they would not die. The people were afraid. They said to Moses, "Behold, we perish. We are undone. We are all undone. Everyone who comes near the tabernacle of the Lord dies. Are we all to perish?" The fear in their voice is genuine and not unreasonable. The God in whose presence they were traveling was not the manageable, negotiable deity of their own manufacture that they had attempted to create at the foot of Sinai. He was something else, something that required an approach, a protocol, a priestly intermediary, something that took seriously the question of who came near and how and with what authorization. The grumbling that had seemed so reasonable, the challenge to Moses and Aaron that had sounded so much like the democratic voice of an equal people asserting their equal holiness, had turned out to have a cost attached that nobody who had signed the petition had seen coming. 14,700 dead, 3 family lines swallowed into the earth, 250 leaders consumed by fire, 1 overnight miracle of blooming almonds. The God of Israel had answered the question of who was holy in terms that left very little room for further debate. The wilderness kept moving. The people kept moving. And the wilderness kept testing, because that is what it was for. At Kadesh, in the wilderness of Zin, Miriam died and was buried there. Miriam, the sister who had stood at the river's edge, watching a basket among the reeds when Moses was an infant, who had led the women of Israel in song and dance on the other side of the sea, who had been struck with leprosy for a week when she had spoken against Moses and his Cushite wife, who had been healed and waited for and welcomed back before the camp moved on, was dead in the wilderness. Like the generation she belonged to. No more detail than that. She came to Kadesh, and she died, and they buried her. And then there was no water for the congregation, and the people assembled against Moses and Aaron. The pattern had become familiar. Suffering provoked complaint. Complaint was directed at Moses and Aaron. Moses fell on his face. God spoke. This time God told Moses to take the staff and assemble the congregation and tell the rock before their eyes to yield its water. Speak to the rock. Moses took the staff from before the Lord and gathered the assembly before the rock. And then Moses, the man who had been patient for 40 years in the wilderness, the man who had fallen on his face interceding for people who were accusing him of murder, the man who had argued with God himself on behalf of a people who could not stop finding new ways to betray everything he had bled for, did the thing he was not supposed to do. He spoke to the people instead of the rock. He said to them, "Hear now, you rebels. Shall we bring water for you out of this rock?" And Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock with his staff twice. Water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank, and their livestock drank. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not believe in me, to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them." This judgment has troubled readers across millennia because, on the surface, striking the rock rather than speaking to it seems like a minor variance from the instructions, hardly the kind of infraction that warrants being barred from the promised land after 40 years of faithful leadership. But the text is not measuring the mechanical deviation from the command. It is measuring something deeper. Moses called the people rebels, then said, "Shall we bring water?" implying that he and Aaron were the agents of the miracle rather than God, then struck in anger rather than speaking in trust, and the combination of those things in that moment constituted a failure to treat God as holy before the people. Moses, of all people, knew what it meant for God to be holy before Israel. He had stood in the cleft of the rock and seen the back of God pass by. He had come down from the mountain with a shining face. He had interceded successfully when God's anger had burned against a golden calf. And in the moment of his exhaustion and his grief and his 40 years of accumulated weariness with a people who could not stop complaining, he let the anger speak when the trust should have. The rock still gave water. The people still drank, but Moses would not cross the Jordan. Aaron's death came shortly after at Mount Hor. God told Moses and Aaron and Eleazar to go up Mount Hor. Aaron would be gathered to his people there. He would not enter the land God had given to Israel because of the waters of Meribah. Moses stripped Aaron of his garments on the mountain and put them on Eleazar his son. Aaron died there on the top of the mountain, and Moses and Eleazar came down. When all the congregation saw that Aaron had perished, all the house of Israel wept for Aaron 30 days. The man who had spoken for Moses before Pharaoh, who had held up Moses' arms at the battle of Amalek, who had run with his censer between the living and the dead, who had watched his own sons Nadab and Abihu consumed by fire for offering unauthorized incense before the Lord, who had worn the ephod and the breastplate with the names of the 12 tribes on his chest, died on a mountain and was stripped of his vestments, and his son wore them down. He was 123 years old. The Israelites continued south around Edom, whose king had refused them passage through his territory. The journey was long and the route was hard, and the people became impatient on the way. They spoke against God and against Moses. "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? There is no food and no water, and we loathe this worthless food." The worthless food they loathed was the manna, the bread from heaven, the daily miracle that had been feeding them for decades in a desert that would otherwise have killed them inside a week. They called it worthless food, which was itself a kind of summary judgment on everything the wilderness had produced in them. Then the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people. They bit the people, and many people of Israel died. The serpents that came were not allegorical. They were snakes, venomous and physical, moving through the camp in numbers, enough to kill a significant portion of the population before the people understood what was happening. The Hebrew word used to describe them, seraph, carries a double meaning. It means fiery, describing either the burning sensation of the venom or the appearance of the serpents themselves, and it is also the root of the word seraphim, the burning ones, the creatures of fire that stand before the throne of God in Isaiah's vision. The serpents that came through the camp were not incidental wildlife. They were a judgment dispatched from the same source that had dispatched every other judgment on the wilderness generation, purposeful and precise, aimed at a people who had just described a daily miracle as worthless food. The people came to Moses and said, "We have sinned, for we have spoken against the Lord and against you. Pray to the Lord that he take away the serpents from us." Moses prayed. And the Lord's response was not to remove the serpents. The serpents stayed. God told Moses, "Make a fiery serpent and set it on a pole, and everyone who is bitten when he sees it shall live." Moses made a serpent of bronze and set it on a pole. And if a serpent bit anyone, he would look at the bronze serpent and live. The bronze serpent on a pole is one of the strangest and most theologically loaded objects in the entire Hebrew canon. The law had been explicit about the prohibition against making images, against fashioning likenesses of anything in heaven or on earth, against the kind of representative art that could slide from symbol into object of worship. And yet here, God commanded Moses to make an image, to hold it up on a pole, and to promise healing to anyone who looked at it. The healing was not in the bronze. The healing was not in the act of looking as a magical procedure. It was in the looking as an act of trust. The people were dying from serpent bites. The serpents were still in the camp. The only response available to them was to turn and look at the thing on the pole, which required them to accept that their healing came from the God who had sent the serpents in the first place. It required them to look at the symbol of the judgment as the instrument of mercy. It required a posture that was almost impossible to adopt without acknowledging everything that had brought them to this moment. The bronze serpent had a complicated afterlife. By the time of King Hezekiah, who ruled Judah roughly 7 centuries after the wilderness period, the bronze serpent that Moses had made was still in existence, still in Jerusalem, and the people of Israel had been burning incense to it, which was precisely the slide from symbol to idol that the law had always warned against. Hezekiah, in one of his reforms, broke it to pieces. He called it Nehushtan, which is simply a word meaning a piece of bronze, the deliberate reduction of an object that had become a cult item to the mere material it was made of. A thing that had once been the instrument of God's mercy in a desert camp had spent 700 years becoming a piece of religious furniture people prayed to. Hezekiah smashed it. Good. But before Hezekiah, and after Hezekiah, and reaching far beyond anything Hezekiah could have anticipated, the bronze serpent acquired a meaning that the people dying of snake venom in the wilderness could not have been expected to understand. Centuries after Moses set the pole in the ground, a rabbi from Galilee sat in the dark with a Pharisee named Nicodemus and said, "As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him may have eternal life." The thing on the pole in Numbers 21 became, in that nighttime conversation, a prefiguring of something the wilderness generation had never imagined. A man lifted up on a frame of wood, carrying the accumulated poison of everything human beings had spoken against God, offering healing to everyone who turned to look at him. The connection is not incidental. It was made explicitly, deliberately, by the person who had the most authority to make it. The wilderness period produced terror in concentrated doses, because the wilderness is where the stakes were most visible. In Egypt, the judgment had fallen on an oppressor nation. In the wilderness, the judgment kept falling on the people being liberated, which is the part that is hardest to absorb, the part that requires sitting with rather than explaining away. The God who had sent 10 plagues on Egypt and parted the sea and rained manna from heaven was the same God who opened the ground under Korah's family and sent serpents through the camp, and this was not a contradiction in his nature. It was the consistent expression of a single nature that took both mercy and holiness with complete seriousness. The wilderness generation had been offered both, repeatedly and at spectacular cost, and they had kept choosing the complaint over the gratitude, the memory of Egypt's food, over the evidence of God's provision, the accusation over the trust. 14,700 dead in the plague after Korah, an unknown number dead from the fiery serpents, 3 family lines swallowed into the earth, 250 leaders consumed by fire, Moses barred from the promised land, Aaron's vestments transferred on a mountaintop, Miriam buried in the sand at Kadesh. The wilderness was not a time of comfortable formation for a nation learning to walk with God. It was a time of excruciating clarity about what walking with God required, and the clarity was purchased at a cost that the next generation, the children who had grown up watching all of this from a height just under 20 years old, would carry with them into the land across the Jordan. 40 years in the wilderness ended not with a triumphant army of veterans, but with a generation of people who had grown up watching judgment fall on their parents, who had buried their fathers and mothers in the sand, who had seen the ground open and the serpents come and the fire descend, and who had been shaped by all of that into something their parents had never quite managed to be. A people with sufficient memory of what happened when you forgot who brought you out of Egypt, who kept you alive in the desert, and whose name was I Am. They would need that memory for what came next, because what came next was a city with walls, and the God who had opened the ground under Korah's feet was about to demonstrate that walls were no more difficult than earth. Jericho was old when Joshua looked at it. It is, by the reckoning of archaeologists who have spent the better part of the last century digging through its layers, one of the oldest continuously inhabited settlements in the human record, a city that had been standing in some form since the 10th millennium before the birth of Christ, watered by a powerful spring in an otherwise arid stretch of the Jordan Valley, ringed by walls that had been built and rebuilt and reinforced across generations of people who understood, in the practical language of survival, that what you could not see coming could not be stopped. The walls of Jericho at the time of Joshua were not the walls of a city that did not know it was in danger. They were the walls of a city that had been expecting this moment and had spent a long time getting ready for it. Jericho was shut up tight because of the people of Israel. No one went out and no one came in. Joshua, who had taken command of Israel after Moses died on the eastern bank of the Jordan, had already done what any careful commander does before committing his forces. He had sent 2 spies across the river and into the city, quietly without announcement, to see the land and to see Jericho specifically. The spies had found their way to the house of a woman named Rahab, who made her living on the margins of the city's economy and who lived, crucially, in a house built into the city wall itself, which gave her particular usefulness to people who needed to get in and out of a fortified city without using the gate. The king of Jericho had already heard that Israelite spies had entered the city and sent his men to Rahab's house, demanding she hand them over. She hid the spies under stalks of flax she had laid out on her roof, and told the king's men they had already left and might be caught if pursued quickly. When the pursuers were gone, Rahab went up to the roof. What she said to the men hidden there was not the speech of a woman running a simple calculation about which side was going to win and choosing accordingly. It was something more honest and more considered than that. She told the spies that she knew the Lord had given this land to Israel. She told them that they knew what had happened in Egypt, that they had heard what had happened at the sea when the Lord dried up the water before the Israelites, and what had been done to the 2 Amorite kings on the other side of the Jordan. She said, "Our hearts melted, and there was no spirit left in any man because of you. For the Lord your God, He is God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath." The woman running a hospitality business in a fortified city that was about to be besieged had arrived, through the medium of widely circulated news and her own reasoning, at a theological conclusion that most of Israel itself had only reached after decades of miracles and judgment, that the Lord was not merely a tribal deity with local jurisdiction, but God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath. Rahab made one request, that when the city fell, her family would be spared. Her father and mother, her brothers and sisters, all who belonged to her, brought under her roof. The spies swore it. They told her to tie a scarlet cord in the window, through which she would lower them down by a rope. The same window, the same cord. When the army came, anyone inside that house would be safe. Anyone outside would not be their responsibility. She agreed. She lowered them down through the window. They told her to go, and she tied the scarlet cord in the window, and she waited. The spies returned to Joshua and told him, "Truly the Lord has given all the land into our hands, and also all the inhabitants of the land melt away because of us." The next morning Israel set out from their camp at Shittim, and came to the Jordan and camped there before crossing. 3 days later, the officers went through the camp and gave the instruction, "When you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God being carried by the Levitical priests, then you shall set out from your place and follow it. Keep a distance of about 2,000 cubits between you and it, that you may know the way you shall go, for you have not passed this way before." The Jordan was in flood. This detail matters because the Jordan at flood stage is not the modest, crossable stream it is at other times of year. The river overflows all its banks during the early weeks of harvest, running high and fast and cold, the kind of water that does not invite wading and does not permit fording. The priests carrying the ark stepped into the edge of the water, and the waters coming down from above stood and rose up in a heap far off, and the water flowing down toward the sea was completely cut off. The priests stood firm in the middle of the dry riverbed while all of Israel passed over on dry ground. When the last person had crossed and the priests carrying the ark came up from the Jordan and their feet were on dry ground, the waters returned to their place and overflowed all its banks as before. 12 stones were taken from the middle of the Jordan, one for each tribe, and set up at their first camp in the land as a memorial. When your children ask what these stones mean, tell them the Jordan's waters were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. They were in the land now, across the river and in it, with Jericho sealed in front of them, and the memory of the Jordan still wet on the feet of those who had carried the ark. Joshua was near Jericho when he raised his eyes and saw a man standing before him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went to him and asked, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" The man said, "Neither, but I am the commander of the army of the Lord. Now I have come." Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped, and said to him, "What does my Lord say to his servant?" The commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, "Take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did so. The echoes of the burning bush are deliberate and unmistakable. The same instruction, the same holiness of ground, the same encounter between a man who had been given an impossible commission and the one who came to stand beside him in it. Then the Lord spoke to Joshua and gave him the most unusual military strategy in the history of warfare. He said, "See, I have given Jericho into your hand, with its king and mighty men of valor. March around the city all the men of war going around the city once. Do this for 6 days. 7 priests shall bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow the trumpets. And when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, when you hear the sound of the trumpet, then all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city will fall down flat, and the people shall go up, every man straight before him. No siege towers, no battering rams, no undermining of the foundations, no cutting off of the water supply, no psychological campaign designed to break the garrison's will before the assault. March around it, blow horns, shout. The most heavily fortified city in Canaan, staffed by a population that had heard what happened at the Red Sea and to the Amorite kings, and whose hearts had melted with fear, was going to be taken by walking and noise. The instrument of victory was obedience to an instruction that no military professional in the ancient world would have recognized as strategy, which was precisely the point. The Battle of Jericho was not designed to demonstrate the military genius of Israel's commanders. It was designed to make the authorship of the victory as clear as possible to everyone watching. Joshua rose early in the morning. The priests took up the ark of the Lord, and the 7 priests bearing the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord walked on and blew the trumpets. And the armed men went before them, and the rear guard came after the ark of the Lord, while the trumpets blew continually. But to the people Joshua commanded, "You shall not shout or make your voice heard, neither shall any word go out of your mouth, until the day I tell you to shout. Then you shall shout." They walked around the city once that first day, in silence except for the sound of the horns, and returned to camp. 6 days they did this, once each day, circling the walls in procession, the armed men and the priests and the ark and the rear guard, the city watching from its walls. The people of Israel walking and saying nothing. Imagine Jericho's perspective across those 6 days. On the first morning, the army of Israel came out of its camp and walked around the wall once and went back. On the second morning, the same. On the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, the same procession, the same circuit, the same return to camp. The horns blowing, but no voices, no war cries, no catapults, no rams, just men walking in a circle around the outside of their walls and going home. The people of Jericho would have watched this, and some of them would have been confused, and some would have been contemptuous, and perhaps some few of them would have had enough theological imagination to understand that what they were watching was not a siege, but a countdown, and that when the counting stopped, something was going to change in a way that no wall could prevent. Only one person in Jericho knew with certainty what was coming and what the cord in her window meant. She waited. On the 7th day they rose at dawn and marched around the city in the same manner 7 times. 7 circuits on the 7th day, which meant that by the time they had finished, the people of Israel had walked around Jericho 13 times in total, and the people of Jericho had watched them do it, and nothing had happened yet. Then Joshua commanded, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. The city and all that is in it are devoted to the Lord for destruction. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in her house shall live, because she hid the messengers we sent. But you, keep yourselves from the things devoted to destruction, lest you take any of the devoted things and make the camp of Israel a thing for destruction and bring trouble upon it. All silver and gold and vessels of bronze and iron are holy to the Lord. They shall go into the treasury of the Lord." When the trumpet sounded, the people shouted, and the wall fell down flat. Not a section of wall, not the gates, the wall, every stone of it, flat. The people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they captured the city. The construction of the sentence matters. Every man was straight before him, which means the wall fell, and where each man had been standing was now his entry point into the city. There was no breach, no gate, no single point of forced entry. The entire perimeter became simultaneously accessible. 2 million people faced a circle of rubble and walked in from every direction at once. They devoted all in the city to destruction, men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep and donkeys, with the edge of the sword. But Joshua said to the 2 men who had spied out the land, "Go into the prostitute's house and bring out from there the woman and all who belong to her, as you swore to her." The young men who had been spies went in and brought out Rahab and her father and mother and brothers and all who belonged to her, and they set them outside the camp of Israel. Then they burned the city with fire and everything in it. Only the silver and gold and the vessels of bronze and of iron they put into the treasury of the house of the Lord. Rahab lived in Israel from that day and to this day, the text says, which is the text acknowledging that she did not disappear into grateful obscurity after her rescue. She was absorbed into the community. She married an Israelite man named Salmon. She appears in the genealogy in the first chapter of Matthew's Gospel, in the direct ancestral line of David and, through David, of the person the New Testament presents as the fulfillment of everything that line was tending toward. The woman with the scarlet cord in the window of a city that fell became the great-great-grandmother of King David. The gap between what she was when the spies arrived at her door and what she became in the genealogy of Israel's greatest king is one of those narrative distances that the story of Scripture keeps covering in a single stride without pausing to explain itself. Joshua pronounced a curse over Jericho on the day it fell. "Cursed before the Lord be the man who rises up and rebuilds this city Jericho. At the cost of his firstborn shall he lay its foundation, and at the cost of his youngest son shall he set up its gates." The city was to remain rubble. Its fallen walls were a monument, like the bronze plates hammered over the altar after Korah, like the staff of blooming almonds, like the jar of manna kept before the ark. A permanent, visible reminder that God had done something here that human military capability did not account for, and that the rubble should be left as evidence. The curse had a long tail. In the 9th century before Christ, during the reign of Ahab over the northern kingdom of Israel, a man named Heel of Bethel rebuilt Jericho. He laid its foundation at the cost of Abiram his firstborn, and set up its gates at the cost of his youngest son Segub, according to the word of the Lord that he had spoken by Joshua the son of Nun. The curse ran to its fulfillment 5 centuries after it was pronounced. 2 sons died. The city was rebuilt. Whether those deaths were coincidence or consequence is precisely the kind of question the biblical narrative leaves open, not because it lacks an opinion, but because the answering of such questions is not ultimately the reader's work to do. 3 centuries after Jericho fell, the event that defines the second half of this section had not yet happened, but its context was being assembled with the patient thoroughness of empires that do not build themselves in a single generation. The Assyrian Empire, centered in the upper reaches of the Tigris Valley in what is now northern Iraq, had been growing since the 14th century before Christ, expanding its territorial reach through a combination of military ferocity and administrative sophistication that made it, by the 8th century before the birth of Christ, the most formidable military power the ancient Near East had ever produced. The Assyrians were not merely an army, they were a system, a comprehensive apparatus of conquest and incorporation that had absorbed Mesopotamia and Syria and was now pressing hard against the borders of the 2 small kingdoms that had once been the unified realm of David and Solomon, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. The northern kingdom of Israel fell first. In 722 before Christ, the Assyrian king Sargon II completed the conquest of Samaria that his predecessor Shalmaneser V had begun. He deported the population, tens of thousands of Israelites carried off to Assyrian territory and replaced by peoples from other conquered regions. A policy designed to break the cultural and ethnic coherence of a subject people before they could organize enough resistance to matter. The 10 northern tribes were scattered across the Assyrian Empire and effectively lost to history. The 10 lost tribes, whose absence from the subsequent record of Israel has been a source of speculation and grief for 27 centuries. The northern kingdom was gone. Judah remained, smaller, more nervous, and suddenly sharing a long border with the most powerful empire in the world. Hezekiah was king of Judah when Sennacherib came. Sennacherib was the son of Sargon, and by the reckoning of the ancient world he was the greatest of the Assyrian kings in the period of Judah's crisis. A man of military genius and organizational ability, and a very high estimation of his own divine status, who campaigned across the known world with the confidence of a person who had not yet encountered a resistance he could not break. His own annals, inscribed on clay prisms that survived the centuries and now sit in museum collections in London and Chicago and Jerusalem, describe his campaign against Judah with the precision of a man dictating his memoirs for maximum posterity. He records having taken 46 of Judah's fortified cities, having deported over 200,000 people, having shut Hezekiah up in Jerusalem like a bird in a cage. The annals then stop, without explaining why the bird in the cage was not taken. The Assyrian royal record, which never hesitated to document victories in granular detail, simply goes silent on what happened next in Jerusalem. The biblical account explains the silence. Hezekiah had come to the throne of Judah at 25 years of age, and had reigned for 14 years when Sennacherib came against all the fortified cities of Judah and took them. In a moment of political pragmatism that he would later regret, Hezekiah had sent a message to Sennacherib saying that he had done wrong, and offering to pay whatever tribute the Assyrian demanded if he would withdraw. Sennacherib set the tribute at 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. Hezekiah stripped everything he had. The silver from the temple treasury, the silver from the palace treasury, and when neither of those was sufficient, the gold from the doors and doorposts of the temple itself. Gold he had himself overlaid on them, now stripped away, to meet the demand of a king who had not the slightest intention of being satisfied by a single payment. Sennacherib took the tribute and sent 3 of his senior officials from Lachish to Jerusalem with a large army. The Rabshakeh, the chief of the royal staff, was the chief spokesman, and the speech he delivered before the walls of Jerusalem was one of the most sophisticated exercises in psychological warfare preserved in any ancient document. He did not merely threaten, he argued. He stood outside the walls and called out in Hebrew, in the language of the people standing on the walls listening, not in Aramaic, which only the educated officials would have understood, and he directed his words not at the delegation that had come out to negotiate, but at the soldiers and civilians behind them. "What is this confidence in which you trust?" the Rabshakeh said. "Do you think mere words are strategy and power for war? In whom do you now trust that you have rebelled against me?" He mocked the possibility of Egyptian military support. Egypt was a broken reed that would pierce the hand of anyone who leaned on it. He then made his most devastating argument, which was theological rather than military. "You say to me, 'We trust in the Lord our God.' Is it not he whose high places and altars Hezekiah has removed?" The Rabshakeh was referring to Hezekiah's religious reform, in which Hezekiah had indeed removed the high places and altars and sacred poles that had proliferated across Judah, centralizing worship in Jerusalem. From the outside, from the Assyrian perspective, this looked like the destruction of religious sites dedicated to the local deity, which meant the local deity might be annoyed about it. Was Hezekiah trusting in a God he had just offended? He was not finished. Has any of the gods of the nations ever delivered his land out of the hand of the king of Assyria? Where are the gods of Hamath and Arpad? Where are the gods of Sepharvaim? Have they delivered Samaria out of my hand? He listed them. All the gods of the lands that had fallen to Assyria, every national deity that had been unable to protect the people who worshipped it. The logic was tight and empirically supported. Assyria had conquered all these lands, and all these gods had been unable to stop it. So why would Judah's God be any different? The Rabshakeh finished with a boast so extraordinary that it either represents the confidence of a man who genuinely believed it, or the calculated audacity of a propagandist who knew that the most effective lies are the ones closest to. What the audience is already afraid might be true. He said, "Moreover, is it without the Lord that I have come up against this place to destroy it? The Lord said to me, 'Go up against this land and destroy it.'" Hezekiah's officials came to him with their clothes torn and told him what the Rabshakeh had said. Hezekiah tore his clothes, covered himself with sackcloth, and went into the house of the Lord. He sent his officials to the prophet Isaiah with a message that was almost more prayer than report. This day is a day of distress, of rebuke, and of disgrace. Children have come to the point of birth, and there is no strength to bring them forth. He used the image of a woman in the extremity of labor with no strength to deliver, which is the image of a moment that has reached its crisis point, beyond which something will happen. But the person in the crisis cannot determine what. He asked Isaiah to pray for the remnant that remains. Isaiah answered without hesitation, "Do not be afraid, because of the words that you have heard, with which the servants of the king of Assyria have reviled me. Behold, I will put a spirit in him, so that he shall hear a rumor, and return to his own land, and I will make him fall by the sword in his own land." Sennacherib was going to hear something that would make him turn around, and he was going to die in Assyria and not in Jerusalem. The Rabshakeh returned to find that Sennacherib had moved from Lachish to Libnah because he had heard that the king of Ethiopia was marching against him. Sennacherib sent a letter. He was not willing to leave Jerusalem alone, even while managing a military threat from the south. The letter said, in terms that covered the same ground as the Rabshakeh's speech, but in writing, and without the opportunity for a response. "Do not let your God in whom you trust deceive you by promising that Jerusalem will not be given into the hand of the king of Assyria. You have heard what the kings of Assyria have done to all lands, devoting them to destruction. And shall you be delivered?" He listed the nations again, the gods that had not saved them, the evidence of the trajectory. It was a well-constructed letter. It had the weight of history behind it. Hezekiah received the letter from the hand of the messengers, and he read it, and went up to the house of the Lord and spread it before the Lord. He spread the letter out before God, which is one of the great images of prayer in the Hebrew Scripture. A man bringing the physical document of his crisis into the space of worship and laying it out flat, as if to say, "Here it is. You can read it yourself. What do you say?" And then he prayed. He began with who God was. "O Lord, the God of Israel, enthroned above the cherubim, you are the God, you alone, of all the kingdoms of the earth. You have made heaven and earth." He acknowledged the Rabshakeh's evidence. "It is true, O Lord, the kings of Assyria have laid waste the nations and their lands, and have cast their gods into the fire. For they were not gods, but the work of men's hands, wood and stone. Therefore they were destroyed." Hezekiah's argument was elegant and completely honest. Yes, Assyria has destroyed all those other gods, but those were not gods. They were wood and stone, and they burned. His request was, therefore, "So now, O Lord our God, save us, please, from his hand, that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you, O Lord, are God alone." Isaiah sent to Hezekiah with the full answer. The Lord had heard Hezekiah's prayer, had heard the Rabshakeh's reviling, and the response was addressed directly to Sennacherib himself in the form of a taunt, God speaking through the prophet in the second person to the man who had written the letter. "She despises you. She scorns you, the virgin daughter of Zion. She wags her head behind you, the daughter of Jerusalem." It is the voice of the God of Jerusalem, treating the most powerful king on earth the way a girl treats a bully she has decided she is no longer afraid of. "You have mocked and reviled me," the oracle continued. "Because you have raged against me, and your complacency has come to my ears, I will put my hook in your nose and my bit in your mouth, and I will turn you back on the way by which you came." The image of the Assyrian hook, the literal hook that Assyrian reliefs depict being pulled through the lips and noses of prisoners of war, was repurposed here. The great hooker of nations was going to be hooked himself and led back the way he came like livestock. The sign given to Hezekiah was this: "This year you shall eat what grows of itself, and in the second year what springs of the same, and in the third year sow and reap and plant vineyards and eat their fruit." This is the sign of a siege interrupted. A population under siege survives on stored food and whatever grows without cultivation in the first year. The same again in the second. And by the third year, the land is free enough for normal agriculture to resume. The sign was built around the promise that the siege would end before it completed a full season. And then the angel of the Lord went out and struck down 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. And when people arose early in the morning, behold, these were all dead bodies. One sentence, one night. 185,000 soldiers, the professional army of the most powerful empire on earth, dead in their camp before morning. The text does not explain the mechanism. It does not describe what the angel looked like, or how the deaths occurred, or whether there was sound or light or any perceptible event in the camp that night. It simply reports that the angel of the Lord went out, and in the morning there were 185,000 bodies. The army that the Rabshakeh had led to the walls of Jerusalem, with a speech about all the gods that Assyria had outlasted, was gone before dawn. Sennacherib departed. He went back to Nineveh. His own annals, which had described the campaign with such precision, fall silent at this point, and he never returned to Judah. His account of shutting Hezekiah in Jerusalem, like a bird in a cage, does not describe opening the cage. History simply records that the campaign ended and Sennacherib went home, which is precisely what Isaiah had said would happen. He did not come into this city or shoot an arrow there, or come before it with a shield or cast up a siege mound against it, the oracle had said. By the way that he came, by the same he shall return. And he shall not come into this city. Not an arrow, not a shield, not a siege mound. The most methodical military empire in the ancient world brought nothing it carried against Jerusalem to bear on Jerusalem, and went home with 185,000 fewer soldiers than it had arrived with. Sennacherib came home to Nineveh, and was worshipping in the house of Nisroch, his god, which is the detail that completes the theological argument the Rabshakeh had been making outside Jerusalem's walls. He had asked where the gods of the conquered nations were, had listed the national deities that Assyria had outlasted. Now the king of Assyria was home at his own temple, the god he had been trusting in while he mocked the God of Israel, and as he worshipped there, his sons Adramelech and Sharezer struck him down with the sword, and escaped into the land of Ararat, and Esarhaddon his son reigned in his place. The man who had called himself the instrument of God's judgment on Jerusalem, who had asked whether the Lord had not sent him to destroy it, died in his own temple at the hands of his own sons, while the city he had tried to take still stood. The bird in the cage had not been taken. The cage was still there. The city was still there. And the god the Rabshakeh had listed alongside the wood and stone deities of Hamath and Arpad, the god whose high places Hezekiah had removed. The god whose power the letter spread before his throne in the temple had asked to demonstrate, had demonstrated it in a single night, without requiring the city to lift a single weapon in its own defense. The fall of Jericho and the death of the Assyrian army share a logic that the narrative of Scripture makes deliberate. At Jericho, Israel walked and shouted, and the walls fell. Before Jerusalem, Israel prayed, and God's angel went out, and 185,000 soldiers were dead by morning. In both cases, the victory was entirely and obviously beyond the capacity of the people experiencing it. At Jericho, the only military activity Israel performed was the walking, and the result was disproportionate to any human calculation of what walking around walls accomplishes. Before Jerusalem, the only military activity was Hezekiah spreading a letter on the floor of the temple and talking to God about it, and the result was the elimination of an army the size of which no ancient Near Eastern nation would have considered engaging in conventional warfare. The terror in both stories is not the terror of random violence or natural catastrophe. It is the terror of a power that operates according to rules the merely human understanding cannot fully map, that responds to obedience in ways that outrun human military logic, and that takes seriously, with deadly seriousness, the question of what comes near it and why. Jericho had heard of the Jordan crossing and the plagues of Egypt, and had sealed itself tight, and could not seal tight enough. The Assyrian army had heard nothing in its own theological tradition that prepared it for the night when the angel went out. Both of them found out, in the most final possible way, what it meant to be in the way of a purpose they had not understood and had not been able to stop. The next section of this story moves deeper into the shadow world of vision and prophecy, into the account of a man standing in a valley full of bones and being asked whether those bones could live, and into the hand of a king writing on a plaster wall in the firelight, while the army outside his city did not yet know that it had already won. Between the fall of the Assyrian army outside Jerusalem's walls and the visions that define this section, the world of the ancient Near East had turned over completely. The empire, whose 185,000 soldiers had been found dead in their camp before dawn, did not survive its humiliation by many decades. Nineveh, the great city, fell in 612 before Christ to a coalition of Babylonians and Medes, its walls breached and its palaces burned. The city that the prophet Nahum had described as the bloody city, full of lies and plunder, reduced to rubble in a siege that lasted only a few months. The Assyrians, who had carried off the northern tribes of Israel and shut Hezekiah up like a bird in a cage, were themselves gone, and the world they had dominated was now under the administration of Babylon, whose king Nebuchadnezzar was perhaps the most formidable conqueror the ancient world had produced since the pharaohs of Egypt's imperial peak. Nebuchadnezzar came against Jerusalem 3 times. The first time, in the year 605 before Christ, he took hostages from the Judean nobility, young men of good family and obvious intelligence and physical fitness who would be educated in Babylon and absorbed into the administrative machinery of the empire. Among them was a young man named Daniel. The second time, in 597 before Christ, Nebuchadnezzar took the young king Jehoiachin, his mother, his wives, his officials, the leading men of the land, the craftsmen, the smiths, all the trained soldiers, 10,000 captives, all of them to Babylon, leaving only the poorest people of the land behind. Among those second deportees was a young priest named Ezekiel. The third time, in 587 before Christ, Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem entirely, broke down its walls, burned the palace and the houses, and most critically, burned the temple. The house God had told Solomon he would set his name in forever, the building that had stood on the hill above the city for 370 years. The Ark of the Covenant disappears from the historical record at this point. Nobody knows what happened to it. It has not been found since. The people sitting in Babylon in the years after the destruction tried to understand what it meant that the city of God was rubble and the temple of God was ash, and they were in a foreign country singing the songs of Zion for the climb, entertainment of people who had defeated them. Psalm 137 preserves the raw edge of that moment. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows we hung our harps, for there our captors required of us songs, and our tormentors mirth, saying, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land?" The question underneath all the other questions was simpler and more devastating. Is it over? Was the Lord only the God of Canaan, only the God of Jerusalem, only the God of the temple? And now that Jerusalem was burned and the temple was ash, was the relationship itself ended? Were they the former people of a former God, sitting in somebody else's country, trying to remember what it had felt like to be chosen? Into this despair, the visions of Ezekiel came. Ezekiel is the strangest of the major prophets. which is saying something in a canon that includes Isaiah seeing the Lord on a throne surrounded by six-winged burning creatures, and Jeremiah buying a field as an act of prophetic theater, while the Babylonian army was literally sitting outside the city gates. Ezekiel's visions begin with a storm wind from the north, a great cloud with fire flashing continually, and from the midst of the fire 4 living creatures, each with 4 faces and 4 wings, moving on wheels within wheels, whose rims were full of eyes, accompanied by the likeness of a great expanse glittering like crystal, and above that expanse the likeness of a throne, and seated on the throne a likeness with a human appearance, with the appearance of fire, and surrounded by brightness like a rainbow in a cloud. Ezekiel saw this vision by the river Chebar in the land of the Babylonians, and fell on his face. And the voice of one speaking came to him and said, "Son of man, stand on your feet, and I will speak with you." He was called Son of Man throughout the entire book, which is simultaneously a reminder of his creatureliness, a human among visions too large for human comprehension, and the particular title that would be claimed, centuries later, by someone standing in the temple courts. Ezekiel was given scroll to eat, a scroll written on both sides with words of lamentation and mourning and woe. He ate it, and it was in his mouth as sweet as honey. A man commissioned to deliver words of judgment was required first to consume them, to take them into his body, to make them part of his own substance before speaking them outward. Ezekiel then spent years as God's messenger to the exiles in Babylon, delivering visions of judgment on Jerusalem before its fall, and then, after its fall, visions of restoration and hope. All of it in the register of someone who had been shown things that exceeded the categories available to the language he was using to describe them. The vision of the valley of dry bones came to Ezekiel in the hand of the Lord, which is how the book describes the state in which prophetic experience arrived, carried, held, transported. The hand of the Lord came upon him, and brought him out in the spirit of the Lord, and set him down in the middle of a valley. The valley was full of bones. Full is not figurative here. The vision emphasizes the quantity and the condition with the patience of someone who wants to make sure the reader understands what the prophet was standing in the middle of. He led me around among them, the text says, and behold, there were very many on the surface of the valley, and behold, they were very dry. Not just dry, very dry, desiccated, bleached, beyond any ordinary category of dead. These were bones that had been lying in that valley for a very long time, long enough for the sun and the wind to strip them of every trace of what they had once been connected to, long enough that the prospect of life in them was not merely unlikely, but geologically absurd. God asked Ezekiel a question. "Son of man, can these bones live?" It is one of the great questions in the biblical record, and the manner of its asking is as significant as its content, because it was not a rhetorical question aimed at a negative answer, not a way of making the obvious point that dead things stay dead. It was a real question, addressed to a real man, in a real valley, and it required a real answer. Ezekiel, who had been eating scrolls of lamentation and delivering messages that had cost him everything, and who had watched his own wife die without being permitted to mourn her publicly as a prophetic sign about how the exiles would receive the news of Jerusalem's destruction, looked at the bones and gave the most honest answer available to him. "O Lord God, you know. Not yes, not no, but you know." The answer of a man who had learned that the categories of possibility he had arrived with were not the categories God was working in, and who therefore deferred the question of what was and was not possible to the only one qualified to answer it. Then God gave Ezekiel an instruction that would have sounded in any other context like the speech of a person who had not understood the situation. "Prophesy over these bones, and say to them, O dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. Say to them, Thus says the Lord God to these bones, Behold, I will cause breath to enter you, and you shall live. I will lay sinews on you, and will cause flesh to come upon you, and cover you with skin, and put breath in you, and you shall live, and you shall know that I am the Lord." Ezekiel prophesied as he was commanded. He preached a sermon to a field of bones, and as he prophesied there was a sound, and behold, a rattling, and the bones came together, bone to its bone. The rattling. The sound of the valley of dry bones beginning to reassemble itself is the detail that has lived in the imagination of readers across 2.5 millennia, because it is so precisely, so accurately, so almost casually described. A rattling, not a trumpet blast, not a thunderclap, not a pillar of fire. A rattling, the sound of calcium and calcium finding each other across the floor of a valley, the mechanical, persistent, entirely impossible sound of a skeleton locating its missing parts, bone to its bone. Every element of every body that had ever lain in that valley, finding the thing it belonged with, assembling in the dark of the vision with the purposefulness of creatures that had somewhere to be. And then sinews came upon them, and flesh covered them, and skin covered them over, but there was no breath in them. A valley full of fully formed bodies, perfectly assembled, completely silent. Assembled, but not alive. Whole, but not inhabited. God spoke again. Prophesy to the breath. Say to the breath, "Thus says the Lord God, come from the four winds, O breath, and breathe on these slain, that they may live." Ezekiel prophesied as he was commanded, and the breath came into them, and they lived and stood on their feet, an exceedingly great army. The Hebrew word used for breath and wind and spirit in this passage is the same word, ruach. The breath of life that entered Adam's nostrils in the garden, the spirit that moved over the face of the deep in the beginning, the wind that drove back the sea, all of it captured in one word. And here it came from the four winds into the assembled bodies of an exceedingly great army that had been dry bones a few minutes ago. God gave Ezekiel the interpretation directly. "These bones are the whole house of Israel," he said. The people had been saying, "Our bones are dried up, our hope is lost, we are indeed cut off." But this is what would happen. God would open their graves and raise them from their graves, and bring them into the land of Israel. He would put his spirit in them, and they would live. He would place them in their own land. The vision was simultaneously about the restoration of the nation after exile, the reconstitution of a people who had experienced their displacement as a kind of death, and, in the way that prophetic vision operates across more than one register at once, a statement about something the exile was only the near and temporal version of, the possibility of resurrection itself, of the God who makes worlds being equally capable of remaking what has been unmade, of breath entering what has been breathless, and of the exceedingly dead becoming the exceedingly alive. The vision of the dry bones is the most terrifying of Ezekiel's many terrifying visions, not because of the bones themselves, but because of the question at its center. Can these bones live? The terror is not in the charnel valley. It is in the recognition that the question is not limited to Ezekiel's historical moment, not limited to the house of Israel in Babylonian exile, not limited to the 6th century before Christ. It is the question that sits beneath every experience of irreversible loss, every moment when what was has been so thoroughly destroyed that its restoration is beyond the horizon of any reasonable expectation. The answer given is not the triumphalist answer that pretends the question was easy. It is the answer that begins with, acknowledges the impossibility, and then proceeds to make the impossible happen in the form of a rattling, persistent, irresistible reassembly that stops for nothing and is complete before you have finished wondering whether it is possible. The other figure in this section was in Babylon at the same time as Ezekiel, though in a very different position within the Babylonian world. Daniel had arrived as a hostage in the first deportation. A young man of the Judean nobility, selected for his intelligence and his physical fitness and his potential usefulness to an empire that was collecting the best minds of the nations it absorbed. He had been placed in the training program for the royal service, had refused the king's food on the grounds that it would defile him according to the dietary laws of his people, and had managed to complete the training on vegetables and water while looking better nourished than the candidates eating the royal rations, which was either a miracle or a very good argument for a particular diet, and probably both. He and his 3 companions had been given Babylonian names. Daniel became Belteshazzar, Hananiah became Shadrach, Mishael became Meshach, Azariah became Abednego. The empire renamed them because empires that absorb people like to rename them, and Daniel accepted the new name and went on being Daniel. He had survived Nebuchadnezzar's reign by interpreting dreams, including a dream of a great statue made of progressively less noble metals, head of gold, chest and arms of silver, belly and thighs of bronze, legs of iron, feet of iron and clay, struck by a stone cut without hands that shattered the statue and became a great mountain filling the whole earth. This dream had represented the succession of world empires, each one less glorious than the last, until a kingdom not made by human hands would end the sequence and establish something that would not be replaced. Nebuchadnezzar had been the head of gold. He had not found this comparison to the top of the statue unpleasant, and Daniel had prospered in Babylon accordingly. But Nebuchadnezzar died, and Babylon's stability died with him over the course of a troubled succession, and by the time the events of the 5th chapter of Daniel occurred, the man sitting on the Babylonian throne was not Nebuchadnezzar, but Belshazzar, who was described in the text as Nebuchadnezzar's son, and who was, by the more complex accounting of historical genealogy, connected to Nebuchadnezzar through his mother and through the line of Nabonidus, the last king of Babylon, who had gone to the oasis of Tema in Arabia and spent most of his reign there, leaving Belshazzar as regent in Babylon. The precise relationships of the late Babylonian royal family are the kind of detail that archaeologists and historians have spent considerable effort untangling, and the consensus that has emerged from that effort is that the author of Daniel was describing the situation with a rough but recognizable accuracy, rather than with the precision of a court chronicle. Belshazzar was the effective ruler of Babylon at the moment the city fell. He was the man with the power. He was the man hosting the feast. The Feast of Belshazzar is one of the great scenes in the biblical canon, and it has the particular quality of a celebration happening in a building that is already on fire, if only the people inside it knew to look up. It was the year 539 before Christ. Cyrus of Persia had been moving through the Mesopotamian world with the methodical efficiency of a man who had done this before, which by that point in his career he had, and the Persian army was at the gates of Babylon, which Belshazzar knew, and which apparently had not yet spoiled his appetite for a banquet. He made a feast for 1,000 of his lords, and drank wine in front of the 1,000. The number of the guests is given for a reason. This was not an intimate dinner, or a small gathering of the most trusted advisers. This was an empire performing its confidence in public, a government staging its own continuity through the medium of a very large, very elaborate party. While he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels that his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines, might drink from them. The vessels from the Jerusalem temple, the cups and basins and utensils that had been made for the worship of the God of Israel, that had stood in the house where God had said he would put his name, that had been carried out of the burning city as trophies of the Babylonian conquest, were now being passed around a banquet table in Babylon, so that the king and his guests could drink their wine from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. The specific list of materials is the materials of the statue in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, minus the clay: gold, silver, bronze, iron. The author is not being accidental. The celebration was, in its deepest structure, a worship service devoted to the premise that the empire made of these materials would last. Immediately, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, opposite the lampstand. The hand was visible. The king watched the hand write. The text specifies the lampstand because the lampstand was the source of light, and the writing appeared where the light fell, in the brightest and most visible part of the room, directly opposite the light source, so that no one present could claim they had been looking the wrong way and missed it. A hand without a body wrote on the wall of the most powerful king in the world's palace, while 1,000 of his guests watched. The king's color changed, and his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. His lords were baffled. The enchanters and Chaldeans and astrologers were brought in and offered extraordinary rewards: purple robes, a gold chain, 3rd place in the kingdom, given to anyone who could read the writing and tell the king what it meant. Nobody could. The king became yet more alarmed. His color changed, and his lords were perplexed. The queen mother, rather than one of the wives and concubines already present, came into the banqueting hall and told the king not to be alarmed. She remembered Daniel. She told Belshazzar that his father Nebuchadnezzar had appointed this man over all the wise men of Babylon, that in him was an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding, that he had been found able to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems. His name is Daniel, she said. Let Daniel be called, and he will show you the interpretation. Daniel was brought before the king. Belshazzar offered him what he had offered the others: the purple, the gold chain, 3rd place in the kingdom. Daniel said, "Let your gifts be for yourself, and give your rewards to another." Nevertheless, he would read the writing and make known the interpretation. But before the interpretation, the rebuke. Daniel had been in Babylon since the first deportation. He was an old man by the time of Belshazzar's feast. He had served across the entire span of the Babylonian Empire's peak, had watched Nebuchadnezzar grow from the conquering king who had burned Jerusalem to the man who spent 7 years living like an animal in the fields, eating grass, his hair growing long as eagle feathers and his nails like birds' claws, a judgment the text records with the same matter-of-fact brevity as everything else, as if the sight of the greatest king on earth crawling through a field eating grass was simply one more data point in the long argument about who was actually in charge of the world. Daniel had watched all of this. He had seen what happened to Nebuchadnezzar when pride outran wisdom. And now he stood before Nebuchadnezzar's successor, who had done the specific thing that even Nebuchadnezzar, for all his arrogance, had not done. And Daniel was not going to let it pass unremarked. "You, his son," Daniel said to Belshazzar, "you have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this. You have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven. You have had the vessels of his house brought in before you, and you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know, but the God in whose hand is your breath, and whose are all your ways, you have not honored." The God in whose hand is your breath. Belshazzar was alive in that moment because the God he had failed to honor was continuing to hold the breath in his body. His life was not his own possession. It was on loan from the hand he had chosen to insult by drinking from the temple vessels. Then Daniel read what the hand had written. 4 words in Aramaic: mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. The doubling of the first word, mene, said twice, is the Hebrew and Aramaic way of giving something emphasis and certainty, the way Pharaoh's double dream of cows and grain had been a sign that what it meant was fixed and coming soon. Daniel gave the interpretation. Mene. God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel. You have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Peres, the singular form of upharsin. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. The words were commercial terms from the language of weights and measures the language of the marketplace where a merchant weighs goods on a scale and determines whether the measure is accurate. Belshazzar had been put on the scale. He had come up short. The transaction was closed. Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed in purple, and a chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. That same night, Belshazzar the Chaldean king was killed. The verse does not pause over this. It does not describe how or by whom in the detail one might expect. That same night. The feast was still clearing up, presumably. The purple was probably still new, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years of age. The Persian army had taken Babylon that night by diverting the Euphrates River, which ran beneath the city walls, and walking in along the dry riverbed, which is an engineering solution of considerable elegance and a remarkable confirmation of the prophetic tradition surrounding Babylon's fall. The city had celebrated its own invulnerability, while the army that ended it was digging channels in the dark. Babylon, the head of gold, the city that had taken the vessels of the Jerusalem temple as trophies, whose king had drunk from the cups of the God of Israel while praising gods of metal and wood. He was ended in the night of its own feast by an army it had not prepared for because it had been too busy hosting a party for 1,000 guests. The visions of beasts that Daniel received across the years of his service in Babylon operate in a register different from the handwriting on the wall. The writing on the wall was a specific message to a specific man about a specific and imminent event. The beast visions were something else. Windows opened onto the long arc of imperial history, given to a man who would not live to see most of what he was shown, preserved in a text that readers in every subsequent century would press against the events of their own time to see whether the shapes matched. In the first year of Belshazzar's reign as regent, before the feast, before the writing on the wall, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head as he lay in his bed. He saw 4 winds of heaven stirring up the great sea, and 4 great beasts came up out of the sea, each different from the other. The sea in the prophetic imagination of the Hebrew Bible is not simply the Mediterranean or any other specific body of water. It is the primordial chaos, the roiling, undifferentiated mass of the unordered world from which the forces of empire rise and to which they return, the deep over which the Spirit of God moved, in the beginning before anything had been sorted into its proper place. What came out of that sea were not natural animals. They were the distorted, composite creatures of a vision aimed at something larger than the merely zoological. The first beast was like a lion, but had eagle's wings. As Daniel watched, its wings were plucked off. It was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and a human mind was given to it. The lion with eagle's wings was the symbol of Babylon, literally. The winged lion was one of the most common images in Babylonian art and architecture, the creature whose statues guarded palace entrances, and whose image was pressed into the baked clay of the Ishtar gate. The transformation in the vision, the wings plucked, and a human mind given echoed the transformation of Nebuchadnezzar himself. The great king who had been humbled until he received something like ordinary human understanding again. The second beast was like a bear, raised up on one side, with 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, "Arise, devour much flesh." The bear raised on one side corresponds to the asymmetry of the Medo-Persian coalition, with Persia dominant over Media, and the 3 ribs have been understood across the commentarial tradition as 3 major kingdoms or campaigns consumed by the Persian expansion. The instruction to arise and devour much flesh was simply a description of what the Persian Empire did, which was conquer most of the known world between the fall of Babylon in 539 before Christ and its own fall to Alexander the Great in 333. The third beast was like a leopard, with 4 wings of a bird on its back, and 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. The leopard's speed has always been its most distinctive characteristic. and Alexander's conquest was legendary for its pace. A campaign that moved from Greece through Asia Minor, through Persia, through Egypt, through Central Asia, and into India in the space of roughly a decade, a rate of territorial acquisition that had no precedent in the ancient world. The 4 heads following Alexander's death correspond to the division of his empire among 4 of his generals, the Diadochi, who carved up what he had built into the Ptolemaic, Seleucid, Antigonid, and Lysimachid kingdoms, each one a piece of the leopard's speed run to ground. The 4th beast was different in kind from the 3 before it, and Daniel's vision labors to describe something that seems to strain the visual vocabulary available to it. It was terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth. It devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what remained with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. As Daniel considered the horns, another horn, a little one, came up among them, and before it 3 of the first horns were plucked up by the roots. This little horn had eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. The 4th beast has generated more interpretive debate than almost any other passage in the prophetic literature. The dominant reading in the Jewish and early Christian tradition identified it with Rome, whose iron legions and iron administrative discipline did indeed devour and break in pieces in a way that no previous empire had quite managed. The little horn speaking great things has been identified by various readers across various centuries with various specific figures, and the identification depends on where in history you are standing when you read it, and which world power is currently generating the most alarm. What happened next in the vision opened into a throne room that no earthly throne room has ever resembled. Thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames. Its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him. 1,000,000 served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. The 4th beast was killed, and its body destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. And then, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. To him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. The phrase Son of Man, used here in Daniel's vision of the heavenly court to describe the figure who receives an eternal kingdom from the Ancient of Days, is the same phrase used throughout the book of Ezekiel to address the prophet himself. The connection between the 2 usages is not accidental, and was not treated as accidental by the tradition that followed. In Ezekiel, it is an address to a human being standing in the presence of visions too large for him. You, Son of Man, are a creature, mortal and limited, and you are being shown these things. In Daniel, it is a title for a figure who is more than a creature, who arrives with the clouds of heaven and receives from the Ancient of Days the thing that the 4 earthly empires had each tried to hold and each failed to keep. The Son of Man in Daniel 7 is not standing in a valley of bones being asked a question. The Son of Man in Daniel 7 is coming to a throne room and receiving an inheritance. When Jesus of Nazareth stood before the Sanhedrin and was asked whether he was the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One, he said, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." He was quoting Daniel 7 directly, applying to himself the specific image of the figure who comes with the clouds of heaven to the Ancient of Days and receives the eternal kingdom. The high priest tore his robes. He understood the claim. Everyone in that room understood the claim. The question before the court was whether the claim was blasphemy or truth, and the court at that moment chose blasphemy, and the trajectory of that choice is what the final section of this documentary will follow. In the 3rd year of Belshazzar's regency, Daniel had another vision, this one featuring a ram with 2 horns and a goat that came from the west with a conspicuous horn between its eyes. The goat crossed the face of the whole earth without touching the ground, which is Daniel's way of describing speed so extreme it had a visual quality of flight. And the ram with 2 horns was the Medo-Persian Empire, and the great horn of the goat was the first king, which the angel Gabriel identified explicitly in the vision as the king of Greece. The great horn was broken at the peak of the goat's power, and 4 horns grew in its place, the 4 successor kingdoms of Alexander's divided empire. Out of one of them came a little horn that grew exceedingly great, and cast some of the host of stars to the ground, and it set itself up to be as great as the prince of the host, and the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of the sanctuary was overthrown. This vision refers, with specificity that has impressed even skeptical historians, to the career of Antiochus IV Epiphanes. The Seleucid king, who in the year 167 before Christ desecrated the Jerusalem temple by erecting an altar to Zeus in it and sacrificing a pig on the altar of burnt offering, an event so catastrophic in the religious memory of Judaism that it generated the Maccabean revolt and is commemorated annually in the Feast of Hanukkah. The animal that was sacrificed in the Jerusalem temple was the same animal used in the Passover, and the desecration was experienced as a direct inversion of everything the temple stood for. Daniel's vision of the little horn that set itself up against the prince of the host described Antiochus with an accuracy that caused some scholars in the modern era to argue that the vision must have been written after the events it describes, because predictive prophecy of that specificity was not a category they were prepared to accept. The debate about the dating of Daniel is one of the great unresolved arguments in biblical scholarship, and the way a person resolves it tends to reveal something about their prior commitments regarding what is and is not possible. The angel Gabriel, who appeared in the vision to explain it to Daniel, addressed the prophet with a title, "O man greatly loved." Daniel, the man who had eaten vegetables in Babylon rather than compromise his dietary laws, who had continued to pray toward Jerusalem 3 times a day in defiance of a royal decree that had been designed to destroy him, who had read the handwriting on the wall to a king who was hosting his own farewell party without knowing it, who had lived long enough to watch the head of gold become the Persian Empire, and to receive visions of what would follow the Persian Empire and what would follow that, was described by a heavenly messenger as greatly loved. The terror of his visions had not produced a man collapsed by dread. It had produced a man who had learned to hold visions of the 4 beasts rising from the primordial sea and the Ancient of Days on his throne of fire, alongside the daily reality of being a government administrator in a foreign empire, and to do both with a fidelity that earned him that description. The valley of dry bones, and the handwriting on the wall, and the visions of beasts rising from the sea belong together in this section, because they share a preoccupation that the earlier events in this documentary, for all their terror, did not fully foreground. The question of time, specifically the question of how much of it there is and what it is tending toward. The flood ended, and the rainbow was set in the sky. Sodom burned, and the smoke rose. The plagues fell, and the Exodus walked out into the desert. The ground opened and closed. The walls fell flat. The Assyrian army was found dead in the morning. Each of those events was terrible and specific, and located in a particular historical moment with a particular before and after. But the Valley of Dry Bones opened a question that went further back than the exile, and further forward than the return. The question of whether the dead could live, whether the God who had made the world could unmake death in the same way he had unmade Pharaoh, whether the rattling of dry bones in a valley was a local vision of a national restoration. or a window into something about the nature of reality that the exile had simply made it necessary to ask. And the beast visions that Daniel received while Babylon still stood opened a window that went further forward than Daniel himself could see, past the Persian Empire and past Alexander and past Antiochus and past Rome, to the court of the Ancient of Days, and the figure coming with the clouds of heaven to receive an everlasting dominion. The terror is not only in the bones, it is in the question. It is in the scale of what the vision is suggesting about the architecture of history and the nature of its destination, an architecture too large to see whole from any point within it, visible only in fragments, in valleys of bones and burning fingers and stone cut without human hands. The last section of this documentary takes those fragments and lays them alongside the final book of the canon, the book written to 7 churches in Asia Minor by a man exiled on a small island in the Aegean, a book whose visions make Ezekiel's wheels within wheels look almost restrained in comparison, and which opens with 4 horses and ends with a city made of light. The island is Patmos. It sits in the southeastern Aegean, small and rocky, roughly 16 kilometers long and 10 kilometers wide. And in the late 1st century, it was used by Roman authorities as a place of banishment, the kind of destination reserved not for people they wanted to execute publicly, but for people whose influence they wanted to neutralize quietly. The man writing from there identifies himself only as John, a servant, a brother, one who shares in the tribulation and the kingdom and the patient endurance that are in Jesus. Whether this is John the Apostle, the son of Zebedee, or a different John has been debated since the 2nd century, and scholars remain divided. What is not in dispute is that the book he produced is unlike anything else in the canon, and that it was written in a moment of acute crisis to communities that were already suffering and who needed not a theological treatise, not a letter of comfort in the conventional sense, but a vision, something to see. Something large enough and strange enough to hold the weight of what they were living through and to reframe it in terms that reached further than their immediate circumstances. The date most commonly assigned to the book's composition is somewhere in the final decade of the 1st century, during the reign of the Emperor Domitian, who ruled from 81 to 96 of the Common Era. Domitian's relationship with the imperial cult, the formal worship of the emperor as divine, was more aggressive than that of most of his predecessors. He reportedly insisted on being addressed as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, and the refusal to participate in the cult's rituals was not merely a personal eccentricity, but a civic and political offense. For Jewish communities, an exemption had long existed, a legal carve-out that recognized Judaism as an ancient religion with ancestral claims. For followers of Jesus, particularly those who had become predominantly Gentile in composition and who no longer sheltered under that exemption, the demand to burn incense before the emperor's image created an impossible situation. Burn the incense and deny the lordship of Christ. Refuse and face the consequences: social ostracism, economic exclusion, imprisonment, and in some cases, death. The 7 churches to whom the book is addressed are real, located communities: Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea, all of them in the Roman province of Asia, strung along a rough postal circuit in western Anatolia. Each receives a message in chapters 2 and 3 that reads with the specificity of a church newsletter written by someone who knows the community intimately. The Ephesians praised for their endurance, but rebuked for having abandoned their first love. The Smyrnans told that their poverty is in fact riches, and that some of them will be thrown into prison. The Pergamenes warned about holding to the teaching of Balaam, and tolerating those who advocate for compromise with imperial culture. The Thyatirans rebuked for tolerating a prophetic figure. The text calls Jezebel, who is teaching the community to eat food sacrificed to idols. The Sardians told bluntly that they have a reputation for being alive but are dead. the Philadelphians commended for keeping the word of patient endurance. The Laodiceans famously told that they are neither hot nor cold, and that their self-assessed wealth conceals a condition of wretchedness and blindness and nakedness. These are pastoral messages, rooted in specific local situations, and they serve as the ground floor of the book before the visions begin. The structural architecture of what follows is one of the most discussed questions in biblical scholarship. What most scholars agree on is that the book is written in a genre called apocalyptic literature, and that understanding that genre is not optional. It is the prerequisite for reading the book at all. Apocalyptic literature is a genre with identifiable conventions. A human recipient, typically described as a seer, receives visions mediated by an angelic figure. The visions are symbolic and encoded in a way that would be recognizable to insiders but opaque to hostile outsiders. The overarching claim of the genre is that what appears to be the state of affairs, the empire triumphant, the faithful persecuted, is not the ultimate state of affairs, and that a heavenly perspective reveals a reality invisible from the ground. Daniel, which the early churches read as prophetic scripture, is the closest biblical precedent. 1st Enoch, 4th Ezra, 2nd Baruch, these are the non-canonical parallels that illuminate the conventions Revelation is working within. Reading Revelation as if it were a newspaper article about the future, a coded calendar of literal events to be deciphered and mapped onto current headlines, is a reading strategy that the genre itself does not invite, and one that has a remarkably poor track record across centuries of attempts. The four major interpretive schools have each staked out distinct ground. The preterist position holds that virtually everything in Revelation chapters 6 through 19 was fulfilled in the events surrounding the Jewish-Roman War of 66 to 70 of the Common Era and the fall of Jerusalem, or alternatively in the persecution under Domitian and the eventual fall of Rome. The historicist position, which dominated Protestant interpretation from the Reformation through the 19th century, reads the book as a symbolic panorama of church history from the apostolic age to the Second Coming, with particular attention to the papacy as the beast figure. The futurist position, particularly in its dispensational form, popularized in the English-speaking world through the Schofield Reference Bible and subsequently through an enormous popular literature, holds that the vast majority of Revelation describes events that have not yet occurred and will occur in a compressed period preceding the return of Christ. The idealist position, sometimes called the symbolic or timeless view, reads the book as a symbolic portrayal of the cosmic conflict between good and evil that repeats across every era of history without being tied to specific events. Most working scholars draw from more than one of these positions and resist being wholly classified by any of them. What the text actually does, beginning in chapter 6, is this. A figure described as a lamb, standing as though it had been slain, approaches a sealed scroll in the hand of the one seated on the throne. No one in heaven or on earth is found worthy to open the scroll, and the seer weeps until told that the Lion of the tribe of Judah has prevailed to open it. The paradox is deliberate and central. The lion who overcomes is the lamb who was slaughtered. Power in this book is consistently redefined, turned inside out, so that the sacrificial death of the lamb is not a defeat to be explained away, but the very mechanism of victory. The scroll has 7 seals. As each seal is broken, something is released into the vision. The first 4 seals produce the 4 horsemen, and they arrive with a cumulative force that is difficult to overstate. The first seal releases a rider on a white horse, carrying a bow, wearing a crown, going out to conquer. The second releases a rider on a red horse who is given a great sword, and who takes peace from the earth so that people slay one another. The third releases a rider on a black horse carrying a pair of scales, with a voice calling out that a quart of wheat will cost a denarius a day's wage, while oil and wine are not to be harmed. the detail suggesting an economic disaster that strikes staple crops while luxury goods survive, which is itself a pointed observation about how catastrophe distributes itself unequally. The fourth releases a rider whose name is Death, and Hades follows close behind. Power is given to this pair over a quarter of the earth, to kill with sword and with famine and with pestilence, and by the wild beasts of the earth. The identification of the first horseman has generated substantial debate whether this rider represents Christ, the Roman imperial machine, a figure of conquest distinct from the war of the second rider, or something else, and no consensus exists. What is structurally undeniable is that the four riders function together as a sequence, each one releasing a dimension of the catastrophic into the world: conquest, war, famine, death. Scholars working in the context of the ancient Near East have noted that these four correspond closely to the classic set of divine judgments found throughout the Hebrew prophets, the tetrad of sword, famine, wild beasts, and pestilence that Ezekiel in particular deploys repeatedly as the formula of covenant judgment. The horsemen are not random, they are the vocabulary of a tradition. The fifth seal shifts the scene dramatically. The breaking of the seal reveals not a rider, but the souls of those who had been slaughtered for the word of God and for the witness they had borne, sheltered beneath the heavenly altar, crying out with a loud voice, "How long, O Lord, holy and true, before you judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth?" They are given white robes and told to rest a little longer, until the number of their fellow servants and brothers who were to be killed as they themselves had been was complete. This is one of the most theologically dense moments in the entire book. The martyrs are not silenced or pacified, they are crying out, pressing the question of divine justice with urgency. The answer they receive is not an explanation, but a promise and a further patience. Not yet, but the reckoning is coming, and those who will join you have not yet been gathered. The vision places the suffering of the faithful inside a cosmic calendar that neither dismisses their pain nor resolves it cheaply, and which frames divine justice not as indifference, but as a timing that exceeds the immediate frame of the sufferer's own experience. The sixth seal is cosmic rupture on a scale that strains any literalist reading without help from the tradition of prophetic hyperbole. An earthquake, the sun becoming black as sackcloth, the moon becoming like blood, the stars of the sky falling to the earth as a fig tree drops its winter fruit when shaken by a gale, the sky vanishing like a scroll that is being rolled up, every mountain and island removed from its place. Kings and generals, the rich and the powerful, the strong and the slave, every free person, everyone hides in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains, calling on the mountains and rocks to fall on them and hide them from the face of the one seated on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. The language is drawn from Isaiah, from Joel, from Amos, from Hosea, the great gathering storm of prophetic imagery for the day of the Lord, reassembled here in concentrated form. The phrase that gives interpreters the most difficulty is the one about the wrath of the Lamb, because it places the mild epithet alongside a terrifying agency, and does so deliberately. Before the seventh seal is opened, chapter 7 inserts what scholars call an interlude, a structural feature Revelation uses repeatedly, placing a scene of heavenly reassurance between sequences of judgment. 4 angels stand at the 4 corners of the earth, holding back the 4 winds until the servants of God have been sealed on their foreheads. The number sealed is 144,000, drawn from the 12 tribes of Israel, 12,000 from each tribe. Whether this number is literal or symbolic, whether it refers to ethnic Israel, to Jewish followers of Jesus, to the full community of the faithful understood as the true Israel, or to something else entirely, is again contested. What follows immediately after the numbered sealing is a vision of a great multitude that no one could number, from every nation and tribe and people and language, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, dressed in white robes, and crying out with a loud voice, the juxtaposition of the numbered and the unnumbered, the named tribes and the nameless multitude from everywhere on earth, has led many interpreters to read the 144,000 and the great multitude as two descriptions of the same reality seen from two angles. The Church of God as counted precisely by God and known completely and simultaneously as a vast and uncountable gathering that exceeds any human census. One of the elders identifies the multitude as those who have come out of the great tribulation, who have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb, another of the book's characteristic paradoxes, the blood that bleaches, the death that cleanses. The seventh seal, when it is opened, produces silence in heaven for about half an hour. After everything that has come before, the silence is its own statement. 7 angels are then given 7 trumpets. The trumpet sequence that occupies chapters 8 through 11 follows a structure broadly parallel to the seals, with escalating intensity. Hail and fire mixed with blood are thrown to the earth, burning up 1/3 of the earth and 1/3 of the trees and all the green grass. A great mountain burning with fire is thrown into the sea, turning 1/3 of the sea to blood, killing 1/3 of the living creatures in it, destroying 1/3 of the ships. A great star falls from heaven, blazing like a torch, falling on 1/3 of the rivers and on the springs of water, and its name is wormwood. And 1/3 of the waters become wormwood, bitter, and many die. 1/3 of the sun is struck, and 1/3 of the moon, and 1/3 of the stars, so that 1/3 of their light is darkened, and 1/3 of the day is kept from shining. The sequence calls on the plagues of Egypt as its primary register, the rivers turning to blood, the darkness, the hail, but extends and intensifies them, universalizing them from the geography of a single river valley to the whole created order. The 5th and 6th trumpets introduce figures drawn from the mythological imagery of the ancient Near East, with an extravagance that has generated more commentary than almost any other passage in the book. The 5th trumpet produces a star that has fallen from heaven to earth, given the key to the shaft of the bottomless pit, which he opens so that smoke rises from it like the smoke of a great furnace. From the smoke emerge locusts with the power of scorpions, commanded not to harm the grass or any green plant or any tree, only people who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. They are described with a specificity that is clearly not meant to be naturalistic. Faces like human faces, hair like women's hair, teeth like lions' teeth, breastplates like breastplates of iron, the sound of their wings like the noise of many chariots, with horses rushing into battle, tails like scorpions with stingers, a king over them who is the angel of the bottomless pit, whose name in Hebrew is Abaddon, and in Greek is Apollyon, destruction, destroyer. They are told they may torment for 5 months, but not kill, and in those months people seek death and cannot find it. The 6th trumpet releases 4 angels bound at the great river Euphrates, and behind them a cavalry of 200 million, riders with breastplates of fire and sapphire and sulfur, horses with heads like lions' heads, fire and smoke and sulfur coming from their mouths, tails like serpents with heads that inflict harm. 1/3 of humanity is killed. And the text adds a detail that is among the most quietly devastating in the book. The rest of humanity, those not killed by these plagues, did not repent of the works of their hands, nor give up worshipping demons and idols of gold and silver and bronze and stone and wood, which cannot see or hear or walk. Nor did they repent of their murders or their sorceries or their sexual immorality or their thefts. The plagues, in other words, do not produce the response they are implicitly designed to provoke. The vision of judgment and the vision of human intransigence run in parallel. Between the 6th and 7th trumpets, another interlude. An angel of great power comes down from heaven wrapped in a cloud, with a rainbow over his head, his face like the sun, his legs like pillars of fire, 1 foot on the sea and 1 foot on the land, holding an open scroll. He calls out with a loud voice like a lion roaring, and when he does, the 7 thunders sound. And John begins to write what the thunders have said, and is told to seal it up, not to write it down, one of the stranger moments in a strange book, a revelation explicitly withheld. The angel swears by him who lives forever and ever that there will be no more delay. When the seventh trumpet sounds, the mystery of God will be fulfilled. John is then told to take the scroll from the angel and eat it, and he does. And it is sweet in his mouth and bitter in his stomach. The word received and the word digested are different experiences, and the text knows this. He is told he must again prophesy about many peoples and nations and languages and kings. What follows is the vision of the two witnesses measured against a temple in a city called in the spirit Sodom and Egypt, where their Lord was crucified, which locates the scene in Jerusalem, while simultaneously interpreting it through the lens of everything Egypt and Sodom represent in the prophetic tradition. Two witnesses prophesy for 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth, with power to shut the sky so that no rain falls during the days of their prophesying, to turn the waters to blood, to strike the earth with every kind of plague. When they finish their testimony, the beast from the bottomless pit makes war on them and kills them, and their bodies lie in the street of that great city for 3.5 days. And people from every people and tribe and language and nation gaze at their bodies and refuse to let them be placed in a tomb. And the inhabitants of the earth will gloat over them and celebrate and exchange presents. After the 3.5 days, a breath of life from God enters them. They stand on their feet. They are called up to heaven in a cloud, and a great earthquake kills 7,000 people in the city. The witnesses have been identified with Moses and Elijah, with the church under persecution, with the two testaments, with Peter and Paul, with a dozen other references across the history of interpretation. The structural function is clearer than the identification. They embody faithful testimony to the point of death. They are publicly humiliated by those who reject that testimony, and they are vindicated by God in a way that is unmistakable and public. The seventh trumpet sounds in chapter 11, and the heavenly voices that follow are not a further plague, but a declaration of accomplished fact. The kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever. The 24 elders who sit on their thrones fall on their faces and worship. The temple in heaven is opened, and the ark of the covenant is seen within the temple. Lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, an earthquake, heavy hail. Chapter 12 is where the book's architecture does something unusual. Rather than continuing the forward march of the sequence, it steps back behind the scenes to show the cosmic drama that underlies the historical drama. A woman clothed with the sun, the moon under her feet, a crown of 12 stars on her head, pregnant, crying out in labor, about to give birth. A great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on his heads, his tail sweeping 1/3 of the stars out of the sky and throwing them to the earth, standing before the woman, ready to devour her child as soon as it is born. The woman gives birth to a male child who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron, and the child is caught up to God and to his throne, while the woman flees into the wilderness, where she is nourished for 1,260 days. War breaks out in heaven. Michael and his angels fight against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fight back and are defeated and thrown down the great dragon, that ancient serpent, the one called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world, thrown down to the earth with his angels. A loud voice in heaven declares that the accuser has been thrown down, he who accuses the brothers and sisters day and night before God, and that they conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they loved not their lives even unto death. The identification of the woman has generated as much interpretive energy as any figure in the book. Roman Catholic interpretation reads her primarily as Mary, the mother of Jesus. Protestant interpretation has generally read her as Israel, or as the Church. Many scholars read her as both simultaneously the community of God that spans the Testaments, the mother of both the Messiah and the Messianic community, a corporate figure whose birth pangs produce the one who rules the nations and then sustain those who bear witness in his name. The dragon's casting down does not end his activity thrown to earth. He pursues the woman, and the rest of chapter 12 describes his war on the woman's offspring, those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. Chapter 13 introduces the two beasts who serve as the dragon's agents in that war. And here the book's engagement with the specific political realities of the late first century becomes most transparent to historical reading, while remaining structurally open to wider application. The first beast rises from the sea, with 10 horns and 7 heads and 10 diadems on its horns, and blasphemous names on its heads. It is like a leopard, its feet like a bear's, its mouth like a lion's mouth. And the dragon gives it his power and his throne and great authority. One of its heads seems to have a mortal wound that has been healed, and the whole earth marvels as it follows the beast. The description draws directly on the 4 beasts of Daniel chapter 7. Lion, bear, leopard, indescribable monster, and recombines them into a single figure, as if the accumulated imperial powers of human history are gathered into one. The beast is allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. It is given a mouth uttering haughty and blasphemous words, blaspheming God and God's dwelling and those who dwell in heaven. It is allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them, and authority is given it over every tribe and people and language and nation. And all who dwell on earth will worship it, everyone whose name has not been written in the book of life of the Lamb. The second beast rises from the earth, with 2 horns like a lamb, but speaking like a dragon. It exercises all the authority of the first beast in its presence, and makes the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast. It performs great signs, making fire come down from heaven in the sight of men, and it deceives those who dwell on earth by the signs it is allowed to work. It causes all, both small and great, both rich and poor, both free and slave, to be marked on the right hand or the forehead, so that no one can buy or sell unless he has the mark, the name of the beast, or the number of its name. The text then addresses whoever has understanding, and gives the number as 666, the number of a man. The practice of gematria, assigning numerical values to letters and calculating names, was common in both Jewish and Greco-Roman antiquity, and most contemporary scholars accept that the number encodes the name Neron Caesar, rendered in Hebrew letters, which produces 666, and which also produces 616 in a variant reading attested in some early manuscripts, corresponding to Nero spelled in the Latin form. The identification with Nero is supported by the detail of the mortal wound that has been healed. Nero died by suicide in 68 of the Common Era, but in the decade or two after his death. A persistent rumor circulated in the eastern Mediterranean that he had not actually died, but had fled to Parthia and would return with an army. The Nero Redivivus legend was real, widely circulating, and politically potent. And the beast with the healed head wound maps onto it with precision that is difficult to attribute to coincidence. What the text does theologically, however, goes beyond any single historical identification. The beast is the parody of the lamb. The lamb appeared to have been slain and yet lives, and so does the beast. The beast demands worship and enforces it through economic coercion, through the mark without which normal participation in commerce is impossible. The question the book is posing to its readers is not a puzzle to be solved, but a choice to be made. Whose image will you bear? Whose mark will you receive? Whose authority will you acknowledge? Chapter 14 brings the 144,000 into view again, now standing with the Lamb on Mount Zion, with his name and his Father's name written on their foreheads, an explicit counter-image to the mark of the beast on the foreheads of those who worship it. They sing a new song before the throne that no one could learn except themselves. They are described as those who have not defiled themselves with women, for they are virgins, a description that has generated significant interpretive debate. With most scholars reading it as a metaphor for fidelity to God drawn from the Old Testament tradition of depicting idolatry as sexual infidelity, rather than a statement about literal celibacy, not least because the group has already been identified as a broad symbolic representation of the faithful community, rather than a celibate male subset of it. 3 angels then fly in the sky in sequence. The first, proclaiming an eternal gospel to every nation and tribe and language and people, telling them to fear God and give him glory, for the hour of his judgment has come. The second, announcing the fall of Babylon the Great. The third, warning with full volume that anyone who worships the beast and its image and receives its mark on his forehead or hand will drink the wine of God's wrath, poured full strength into the cup of his anger, and will be tormented with fire and sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb, and the smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever, and they have no rest, day or night. The statement is among the most severe in the entire book, and the proximity of the Lamb's presence to the scene of torment, not indifferently elsewhere, but present and witnessing, is one of the details that neither the consoling nor the punitive readings of the passage can fully metabolize. A son of man on a cloud with a golden crown and a sharp sickle harvests the earth. Another angel brings a second sickle and gathers the grape harvest of the earth, throwing it into the great winepress of the wrath of God outside the city. And blood flows from the winepress as high as a horse's bridle, for a distance of 1,600 stadia, roughly 300 kilometers. The geography is inexact, and the scale is impossible in naturalistic terms, but the image of the winepress of divine wrath is drawn directly from Isaiah 63, where a lone figure comes from Edom with garments stained red, who has trodden the winepress in anger and fury, the nations trodden underfoot. The book takes that image and amplifies it to its outer limits. Chapters 15 and 16 present the 7 bowls of wrath, poured out by 7 angels on the earth, in a sequence that is both parallel to the trumpets and more complete and less partial. In its scope, the trumpets struck thirds, the bowls strike everything. The first bowl pours out on the earth and brings harmful and painful sores on the people who bore the mark of the beast. The second turns the sea to blood like that of a corpse, killing every living thing in the sea. The third turns rivers and springs to blood, and an angel declares that God is just to give those who have shed the blood of saints and prophets blood to drink, for it is what they deserve. The fourth is poured on the sun, scorching people with fire. The fifth pours darkness on the throne of the beast, and people gnaw their tongues in anguish and curse God and do not repent. The sixth dries up the Euphrates to prepare the way for the kings from the east. And 3 unclean spirits like frogs come from the mouths of the dragon and the beast and the false prophet, performing signs to assemble the kings of the whole world for battle at the place called in Hebrew Armageddon, Har Megiddo, the hill or mountain of Megiddo, a place where battles of decisive historical importance had been fought, its name carrying the resonance of confrontation and catastrophe deep in the memory of Israel. The 7th is poured into the air, and a loud voice from the temple says, "It is done." Lightning, rumblings, thunder, and the greatest earthquake since humanity existed on earth, so great is it. The great city splits into 3 parts. The cities of the nations fall. Babylon the Great is remembered before God to give her the cup of the wine of the fury of his wrath. Every island flees and no mountain is found. And great hailstones, weighing about a talent, roughly 32 kilograms, fall from heaven on people. Chapters 17 and 18 constitute the most sustained political allegory in the book, though the word allegory undersells its tone, which is prosecutorial rather than literary. An angel carries the seer into a wilderness to show him the judgment of the great prostitute who is seated on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality, and with the wine of whose sexual immorality the dwellers on earth have become drunk. What he sees is a woman sitting on a scarlet beast full of blasphemous names, with 7 heads and 10 horns. She is clothed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the impurities of her sexual immorality, and on her forehead is written a name of mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and of earth's abominations. She is drunk with the blood of the saints. The angel explains that the 7 heads of the beast are 7 hills on which the woman is seated, and Rome was universally known in antiquity as the city on 7 hills, a detail so specific that no serious scholar proposes a different referent for the woman here. Rome, identified as Babylon, the code name used elsewhere in Jewish literature of the period for the empire that has destroyed the temple and exiled the people, is the object of the vision's sustained indictment. The 10 horns are 10 kings who have not yet received royal power, but who will give their power and authority to the beast for a single hour, who will make war on the Lamb, and the Lamb will conquer them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings. Chapter 18 is an extended lament over the fall of Babylon, written in the genre of the prophetic funeral dirge, the China form of Hebrew poetry, which Jeremiah and Ezekiel both used for oracles against foreign nations. The merchants of the earth weep and mourn for her, since no one buys their cargo anymore, and the cargo list that follows is remarkable for its specificity. Gold, silver, jewels, pearls, fine linen, purple cloth, silk, scarlet cloth, all kinds of scented wood, all kinds of articles of ivory, all kinds of articles of costly wood, bronze, iron, marble, cinnamon, spice, incense, myrrh, frankincense, wine, oil, fine flour, wheat, cattle, sheep, horses, chariots, slaves, and human souls. The list moves from luxury goods to staples to animals to people, the commodification of persons placed at the end as the final and worst item in the catalog of what the empire has trafficked. Every ship captain and seafarer stands far off, weeping over the city's smoking ruins. But alongside the merchant's lament is a counter voice, addressed to God's people. Rejoice over her, O heaven, you saints and apostles and prophets, for God has given judgment for you against her. The commercial mourning and the heavenly rejoicing occupy the same chapter, the same fall seen from 2 incompatible perspectives, and the text holds both without resolving the tension aesthetically. Chapter 19 opens with the sound of a great multitude in heaven crying, Hallelujah! Salvation and glory and power belong to God, for his judgments are true and just. The 4 living creatures fall down and worship. A voice calls all the servants of God to praise him, and the great multitude cries out like the roar of many waters, and like the sound of mighty peals of thunder. The Lord God, the Almighty, reigns. Let us rejoice and exult and give him glory, for the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his bride has made herself ready, clothed in fine linen, bright and pure, the linen representing the righteous deeds of the saints. A beatitude is pronounced. Blessed are those who are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb. The marriage supper image draws on a tradition that runs from Isaiah's feast on the mountain through the wedding parables of the synoptic Gospels, and its placement here after the fall of Babylon, before the final battles, frames what follows as the resolution of a long betrothal rather than a violent military operation. Then the heavens open, and a white horse appears, its rider called Faithful and True, judging and making war in righteousness, with eyes like a flame of fire and on his head many diadems. Wearing a robe dipped in blood, the armies of heaven following on white horses, clothed in fine linen, white and pure. From his mouth comes a sharp sword to strike down the nations. He will rule them with a rod of iron. He treads the winepress of the fury of the wrath of God the Almighty. On his robe and on his thigh is written a name, King of kings and Lord of lords. An angel standing in the sun calls with a loud voice to all the birds that fly to come and gather for the great supper of God, to eat the flesh of kings, the flesh of captains, the flesh of mighty men, the flesh of horses and their riders, the flesh of all men, both free and slave, both small and great. The grotesque counter-image to the marriage supper of the Lamb, the feast of the birds, draws on Ezekiel's oracle against Gog from the land of Magog in chapters 38 and 39, where God calls the birds and beasts to a great sacrifice on the mountains of Israel. The beast and the kings of the earth and their armies gather to make war against the rider on the horse, and the beast is captured, and with it the false prophet who performed signs, and both are thrown alive into the lake of fire that burns with sulfur. The rest are killed by the sword that comes from the mouth of the rider on the horse, and all the birds are gorged with their flesh. Chapter 20 is where the millennial question is located, and it has probably generated more intra-Christian controversy than almost any other passage in the book. An angel comes down from heaven, holding the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain. He seizes the dragon, that ancient serpent who is the devil and Satan, and binds him for 1,000 years, and throws him into the pit, shutting it and sealing it over him, so that he might not deceive the nations any longer, until the 1,000 years were ended. After that, he must be released for a little while. Thrones are set up, and those who sit on them are given authority to judge. The souls of those who had been beheaded for the testimony of Jesus and for the word of God, and those who had not worshipped the beast or its image and had not received its mark on their foreheads or their hands, come to life and reign with Christ for 1,000 years. This is called the first resurrection, and those who share in it are blessed, for over them the second death has no power. They will be priests of God and of Christ, and will reign with him for 1,000 years. The three major positions on this passage, premillennialism, postmillennialism, and amillennialism, differ not only in their reading of a single chapter, but in their understanding of the entire logic of the book. Premillennialism reads the 1,000-year reign as a literal future period that follows Christ's return and precedes the final judgment, with Christ physically reigning on earth. Dispensational premillennialism in particular adds layers of structure, a rapture, a 7-year tribulation, a distinction between the role of national Israel and the church that the text itself does not explicitly supply, and which depend on an elaborate system of cross-referencing, built largely in the 19th century. Historic or classic premillennialism holds similar expectations about a future millennium, but without the dispensational apparatus. Postmillennialism expects the 1,000-year period to be one of expanding Christian influence across the earth preceding the return of Christ, with the millennium being the long arc of gospel progress rather than a post-return reign. Amillennialism, the position dominant in much of the Reformed and Lutheran tradition and widely held in Catholic and Orthodox Christianity, reads the 1,000 years as a symbolic representation of the present age. The period between the first and second advents, during which Satan is bound in the sense that he cannot prevent the gospel from reaching all nations, and the reign of the saints refers to the fellowship of the faithful with Christ in the heavenly dimension, the souls of the martyrs already in Christ's presence. When the 1,000 years are ended, Satan is released from his prison and goes out to deceive the nations at the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog. To gather them for battle, their number is like the sand of the sea. They march across the breadth of the earth and surround the camp of the saints and the beloved city, and fire comes down from heaven and consumes them. And the devil who had deceived them is thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet already are, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. Then a great white throne appears, and him who is seated on it. Earth and sky flee from his presence, and no place is found for them. The dead, great and small, stand before the throne, and books are opened. Another book is opened, which is the book of life, and the dead are judged by what is written in the books, according to what they had done. The sea gives up the dead who are in it. Death and Hades give up the dead who are in them, and they are judged, each one of them, according to what they had done. Then death and Hades are thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. And if anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. The great white throne scene is the most austere in the book. No symbolism, no bestiary, no starfalls or earthquakes. Just the throne, the one seated on it before whom nothing can stand, the books, and the dead of every era brought into account. The image of the book of life appears first in Exodus, when Moses asks God to blot him out of it as atonement for Israel's sin, and runs through the Psalms and Daniel and the letters to the 7 churches. Its presence here, alongside the books of deeds, raises a question the text does not resolve: whether judgment is by deeds alone, or whether the book of life operates on a different principle, and how the two relate. What is stated plainly is the completeness of the reckoning. No one is missed, no era is unaccounted for, no death is an escape from the accounting. The sea gives up its dead. Death itself gives up its dead. And then death, having given everything up, is thrown into the lake of fire, and abolished the last enemy, as Paul had put it in his first letter to the Corinthians, destroyed.